On that first day when Muad'Dib rode through the streets of Erechim with his family, some of the people along the way recalled the legends and the prophecy, and they ventured to shout, Mahdi. But their shout was more a question than a statement, for as yet they could only hope he was the one foretold as the Lisan al-Ghaib, the voice from the outer world. Their attention was focused, too, on the mother, because they had heard she was a Bene Gesserit, and it was obvious to them that she was like the other Lisan al-Ghaib. From Manual of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
The Duke found Thufir Hawat alone in the corner room to which a guard directed him. There was the sound of men setting up communications equipment in an adjoining room, but this place was fairly quiet. The Duke glanced around as Hawat arose from a paper-cluttered table. It was a green-walled enclosure with, in addition to the table, 3 suspensor chairs from which the Harkonnen H had been hastily removed, leaving an imperfect colour patch.
The chairs are liberated, but quite safe. Where is Paul, sire?
I left him in the conference room. I'm hoping he'll get some rest without me there to distract him.
Hawat nodded, crossed to the door to the adjoining room, closed it, shutting off the noise of static and electronic sparking.
Thufir, the Imperial and Harkonnen stockpiles of spice attract my attention.
My lord.
The Duke pursed his lips.
Storehouses are susceptible to destruction.
He raised a hand as Hawat started to speak.
Ignore the Emperor's hoard. He'd secretly enjoy it if the Harkonnens were embarrassed. And can the Baron object if something is destroyed which he cannot openly admit that he has?
We've few men to spare, sire.
Use some of Idaho's men. And perhaps some of the Fremen would enjoy a trip off-planet. A raid on Giedi Prime. There are tactical advantages to such a diversion, Thufir.
As you say, my lord.
Hawat turned away, and the Duke saw evidence of nervousness in the old man, thought, perhaps he suspects I distrust him. He must know I've private reports of traitors. Well, best quiet his fears immediately.
Thufir, since you're one of the few I can trust completely, there's another matter bears discussion. We both know how constant a watch we must keep to prevent traitors from infiltrating our forces. But I have 2 new reports.
Hawat turned, stared at him, and later repeated the stories Paul had brought. Instead of bringing on the intense Mentat concentration, the reports only increased Hawat's agitation. Leto studied the old man.
You've been holding something back, old friend. I should have suspected when you were so nervous during staff. What is it that was too hot to dump in front of the full conference?
Hawat's sappho-stained lips were pulled into a prim, straight line with tiny wrinkles radiating into them.
My lord, I don't quite know how to broach this.
We've suffered many a scar for each other, Thufir. You know you can broach any subject with me.
Hawat continued to stare at him, thinking, this is how I like him best. This is the man of honor who deserves every bit of my loyalty and service. Why must I hurt him?
Well?
It's a scrap of note. We took it from a Harkonnen courier. The note was intended for an agent named Pardee. We've good reason to believe Pardee was top man in the Harkonnen underground here. The note, it's a thing that could have great consequence or no consequence. It's susceptible to various interpretations.
What's the delicate content of this note?
Scrap of note, my lord. Incomplete. It was on mnemic film with the usual destruction capsule attached. We stopped the acid action just short of full erasure, leaving only a fragment. The fragment, however, is extremely suggestive.
Yes?
Hawat rubbed at his lips.
It says, Ato will never suspect, and when the blow falls on him from a beloved hand, its source alone should be enough to destroy him. The note was under the Baron's own seal, and I've authenticated the seal.
Your suspicion is obvious.
I'd sooner cut off my arms than hurt you. My lord, what if—
The Lady Jessica. Couldn't you wring the facts out of this party?
Unfortunately, Party no longer was among the living when we intercepted the courier. The courier, I'm certain, did not know what he carried.
I see.
Leto shook his head, thinking, what a slimy piece of business. There can't be anything in it. I know my woman.
My lord, if—
No! There's a mistake here that—
We cannot ignore it, my lord.
She's been with me for 16 years. There have been countless opportunities for— You yourself investigated the school and the woman.
Things have been known to escape me.
It's impossible, I tell you. The Harkonnens want to destroy the Atreides line. Meaning Paul, too. They've already tried once. Could a woman conspire against her own son?
Perhaps she doesn't conspire against her son, and yesterday's attempt could have been a clever sham.
It couldn't have been a sham.
Sire, she isn't supposed to know her parentage, but what if she does know? What if she were an orphan, say, orphaned by an Atreides?
She'd have moved long before now. Poison in my drink, a stiletto at night. Who has had better opportunity?
The Harkonnens mean to destroy you, my lord. Their intent is not just to kill. There's a range of fine distinctions in Conley. This could be a work of art among vendettas.
The Duke's shoulders slumped. He closed his eyes, looking old and tired. It cannot be, he thought. The woman has opened her heart to me.
What better way to destroy me than to sow suspicion of the woman I love?
An interpretation I've considered. Still.
The Duke opened his eyes, stared at Hawat, thinking, let him be suspicious. Suspicion is his trade, not mine. Perhaps if I appear to believe this, that will make another man careless.
What do you suggest?
For now, constant surveillance, my lord. She should be watched at all times. I will see it's done unobtrusively. Idaho would be the ideal choice for the job. Perhaps in a week or so we can bring him back. There's a young man we've been training in Idaho's troop who might be ideal to send to the Fremen as a replacement. He's gifted in diplomacy.
Don't jeopardize our foothold with the Fremen.
Of course not, sir.
And what about Paul?
Perhaps we could alert Dr. Yui.
Leto turned his back on Hawat.
I leave it in your hands.
I shall use discretion, my lord.
At least I can count on that, Leto thought.
I will take a walk. If you need me, I'll be within the perimeter. The guard can—
My lord, before you go, I have a film clip you should read. It's a first approximation analysis on the Fremen religion. You'll recall you asked me to report on it.
The Duke paused, spoke without turning.
Will it not wait?
Of course, my lord. You asked what they were shouting, though. It was Mahdi. They directed the term at the young master. When they—
At Paul?
Yes, my lord. They've a legend here, a prophecy, that a leader will come to them, child of a Bene Gesserit, to lead them to true freedom. It follows the familiar Messiah pattern.
They think Paul is this...
They only hope, my lord.
Hawat extended a film clip capsule. The Duke accepted it, thrust it into a pocket.
I'll look at it later.
Certainly, my lord.
Right now, I need time to think.
Yes, my lord.
The Duke took a deep, sighing breath, strode out the door. He turned to his right, down the hall, began walking, hands behind his back, paying little attention to where he was. There were corridors, and stairs, and balconies, and halls, people who saluted and stood aside for him. In time he came back to the conference room, found it dark, and Paul asleep on the table with a guard's robe thrown over him and a ditty pack for a pillow. The Duke walked softly down the length of the room and onto the balcony overlooking the landing field. A guard at the corner of the balcony, recognizing the Duke by the dim reflection of lights from the field, snapped to attention. At ease, the Duke murmured. He leaned against the cold metal of the balcony rail. A pre-dawn hush had come over the desert basin. He looked up. Straight overhead, the stars were a sequin shawl flung over blue-black. Low on the southern horizon, the night's second moon peered through a thin dust haze, an unbelieving moon that looked at him with a cynical light. As the Duke watched, the moon dipped beneath the shield wall cliffs, frosting them, and in the sudden intensity of darkness, he experienced a chill. He shivered. Anger shot through him. The Harkonnens have hindered and hounded and hunted me for the last time, he thought. They are dung heaps with village provost minds. Here I make my stand. And he thought, with a touch of sadness, I must rule with eye and claw, as the hawk among lesser birds. Unconsciously, his hand brushed the hawk emblem on his tunic. To the east, the night grew a faggot of luminous grey, then seashell opalescence that dimmed the stars. There came the long, bell-tolling movement of dawn striking across a broken horizon. It was a scene of such beauty, it caught all his attention. Some things beggar likeness, he thought. He had never imagined anything here could be as beautiful as that shattered red horizon and the purple and ochre cliffs. Beyond the landing field, where the night's faint dew had touched life into the hurried seeds of Arrakis, he saw great puddles of red blooms and, running through them, an articulate tread of violet, like giant footsteps. "It's a beautiful morning, sir," the guard said. "Yes, it is." The Duke nodded, thinking, perhaps this planet could grow on one. Perhaps it could become a good home for my son. Then he saw the human figures moving into the flower fields, sweeping them with strange scythe-like devices, dew-gatherers. Water so precious here that even the dew must be collected. And it could be a hideous place, the Duke thought.
There is probably no more terrible instant of enlightenment than the one in which you discover your father is a man with human flesh. From Collected Sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
The Duke said, "Paul, I'm doing a hateful thing, but I must." He stood beside the portable poison snooper that had been brought into the conference room for their breakfast. The thing's sensor arms hung limply over the table, reminding Paul of some weird insect newly dead. The Duke's attention was directed out the windows at the landing field and its roiling of dust against the morning sky. Paul had a viewer in front of him containing a short film clip on Fremen religious practices. The clip had been compiled by one of Hawat's experts, and Paul found himself disturbed by the references to himself. Matif. Lisan al-Gaib. He could close his eyes and recall the shouts of the crowds. So that is what they hope, he thought. And he remembered what the old Reverend Mother had said. Kwisatz Haderach. The memories touched his feelings of terrible purpose, shading this strange world with sensations of familiarity that he could not understand. "A hateful thing," the Duke said. "What do you mean, sir?" Leto turned, looked down at his son. "Because the Harkonnens think to trick me by making me distrust your mother. And they don't know that I'd sooner distrust myself." "I don't understand, sir." Again, Leto looked out the windows. The white sun was well up into its morning quadrant. Milky light picked out a boiling of dust clouds that spilled over into the blind canyons interfingering the shield wall. Slowly, speaking in a slow voice to contain his anger, the Duke explained to Paul about the mysterious note. "You might just as well mistrust me," Paul said. "They have to think they've succeeded," the Duke said. "They must think me this much of a fool. It must look real. Even your mother may not know the sham." "But, sir, why?" "Your mother's response must not be an act. Oh, she's capable of a supreme act, but too much rides on this. I hope to smoke out a traitor. It must seem that I've been completely cozened. She must be hurt this way that she does not suffer greater hurt. Why do you tell me, father? Maybe I'll give it away. They'll not watch you in this thing, the Duke said. You'll keep the secret. You must. He walked to the windows, spoke without turning. This way, if anything should happen to me, you can tell her the truth. That I never doubted her, not for the smallest instant. I should want her to know this. Paul recognized the death thoughts in his father's words, spoke quickly. Nothing's going to happen to you, sir. Be silent, son. Paul stared at his father's back, seeing the fatigue in the angle of the neck, in the line of the shoulders, in the slow movements. You're just tired, father. I am tired, the Duke agreed. I'm morally tired. The melancholy degeneration of the great houses has afflicted me at last, perhaps, and we were such strong people once. Paul spoke in quick anger. Our house hasn't degenerated, hasn't it? The Duke turned, faced his son, revealing dark circles beneath hard eyes, a cynical twist of mouth. I should wed your mother, make her my duchess. Yet, my unwedded state gives some houses hope they may yet ally with me through their marriageable daughters, he shrugged. So, Mother has explained this to me. Nothing wins more loyalty for a leader than an air of bravura, the Duke said. I, therefore, cultivate an air of bravura. You lead well, Paul protested. You govern well. Men follow you willingly and love you. My propaganda corps is one of the finest, the Duke said. Again he turned to stare out at the basin. There's greater possibility for us here on Arrakis than the Imperium could ever suspect. Yet sometimes I think it'd have been better if we'd run for it, gone renegade. Sometimes I wish we could sink back into anonymity among the people, become less exposed to— Father! Yes, I am tired, the Duke said. Did you know we're using spice residue as raw material, and already have our own factory to manufacture film base? Sir? We mustn't run short of film base, the Duke said. Else, how could we flood village and city with our information? The people must learn how well I govern them. How would they know if we didn't tell them? You should get some rest, Paul said. Again, the Duke faced his son. Arrakis has another advantage I almost forgot to mention. Spice is in everything here. You breathe it and eat it in almost everything. And I find that this imparts a certain natural immunity to some of the most common poisons of the Assassin's Handbook. And the need to watch every drop of water puts all food production, yeast culture, hydroponics, chemovit, everything under the strictest surveillance. We cannot kill off large segments of our population with poison, and we cannot be attacked this way either. Arrakis makes us moral and ethical. Paul started to speak, but the Duke cut him off, saying, I have to have someone I can say these things to, son. He sighed, glanced back at the dry landscape where even the flowers were gone now, trampled by the dew-gatherers, wilted under the early sun. On Caladan we ruled with sea and air power, the Duke said. Here we must scrabble for desert power. This is your inheritance, Paul. What is to become of you if anything happens to me? You'll not be a renegade house, but a guerrilla house, running, hunted. Paul groped for words, could find nothing to say. He had never seen his father this despondent. To hold Arrakis, the Duke said, one is faced with decisions that may cost one his self-respect. He pointed out the window to the Atreides' green and black banner hanging limply from a staff at the edge of the landing field. That honourable banner could come to mean many evil things. Paul swallowed in a dry throat. His father's words carried futility, a sense of fatalism that left the boy with an empty feeling in his chest. The Duke took an anti-fatigue tablet from a pocket, gulped it dry. Power and fear," he said. "The tools of statecraft. I must order a new emphasis on guerrilla training for you. That film clip there, they call you Mahdi, Lisan al-Gaib. As a last resort, you might capitalize on that." Paul stared at his father, watching the shoulders straighten as the tablet did its work, but remembering the words of fear and doubt. "What's keeping that ecologist?" the Duke muttered. "I told Thufir to have him here early."
My father, the Padishah Emperor, took me by the hand one day, and I sensed in the ways my mother had taught me that he was disturbed. He led me down the hall of portraits to the ego-likeness of the Duke Leto Atreides. I marked the strong resemblance between them, my father and this man in the portrait, both with thin, elegant faces and sharp features dominated by cold eyes. "Princess daughter," my father said, "I would that you'd been older when it came time for this man to choose a woman." My father was 71 at the time, and looking no older than the man in the portrait, and I was but 14. Yet I remember deducing in that instant that my father secretly wished the Duke had been his son, and disliked the political necessities that made them enemies. In My Father's House by Princess Irulan.
His first encounter with the people he had been ordered to betray left Dr. Kynes shaken. He prided himself on being a scientist to whom legends were merely interesting clues, pointing toward cultural roots. Yet the boy fitted the ancient prophecies so precisely. He had the questing eyes, and the air of reserved candor. Of course, the prophecy left certain latitude as to whether the mother goddess would bring the Messiah with her, or produce him on the scene. Still, there was this odd correspondence between prediction and persons. They met in mid-morning outside the Arrakeen Landing Field's administration building. An unmarked ornithopter squatted nearby, humming softly on standby like a somnolent insect. An Atreides guard stood beside it with bared sword and the faint air distortion of a shield around him. Kynes sneered at the shield pattern, thinking, Arrakis has a surprise for them there. The planetologist raised a hand, signalled for his Fremen guard to fall back. He strode on ahead toward the building's entrance, the dark hole in plastic-coated rock. So exposed, that monolithic building, he thought, so much less suitable than a cave. Movement within the entrance caught his attention. He stopped, taking the moment to adjust his robe and the set of his still-suit at the left shoulder. The entrance doors swung wide. Atreides guards emerged swiftly, all of them heavily armed, slow pellet stunners, swords and shields. Behind them came a tall man, hawk-faced, dark of skin and hair. He wore a jubba cloak with Atreides' crest at the breast, and wore it in a way that betrayed his unfamiliarity with the garment. It clung to the legs of his still-suit on one side. It lacked a free-swinging, striding rhythm. Beside the man walked a youth with the same dark hair, but rounder in the face. The youth seemed small for the 15 years Kynes knew him to have, but the young body carried a sense of command, a poised assurance, as though he saw and knew things all around him that were not visible to others. And he wore the same style cloak as his father, yet with casual ease that made one think the boy had always worn such clothing. The Mahdi will be aware of things others cannot see, went the prophecy. Kynes shook his head, telling himself, they're just people. With the two, garbed like them for the desert, came a man Kynes recognized, Gurney Halleck. Kynes took a deep breath to still his resentment against Halleck, who had briefed him on how to behave with the Duke and ducal heir. You may call the Duke my lord or sire. Noble-born also is correct, but usually reserved for more formal occasions. The son may be addressed as young master or my lord. The Duke is a man of much leniency, but brooks little familiarity. And Kynes thought as he watched the group approach, they'll learn soon enough who's master on Arrakis. Order me questioned half the night by that mentat, will they? Expect me to guide them on an inspection of spice mining, do they? The import of Hawat's questions had not escaped Kynes. They wanted the Imperial bases, and it was obvious they'd learned of the bases from Idaho. "I will have Stilgar send Idaho's head to this Duke," Kynes told himself. The ducal party was only a few paces away now, their feet in desert boots crunching the sand. Kynes bowed. "My Lord Duke." As he had approached the solitary figure standing near the ornithopter, Leto had studied him, tall, thin, dressed for the desert in loose robe, stillsuit, and low boots. The man's hood was thrown back, its veil hanging to one side, revealing long sandy hair, a sparse beard. The eyes were that fathomless blue within blue under thick brows. Remains of dark stains smudged his eye sockets. "You're the ecologist," the Duke said. "We prefer the old title here, my lord," Kynes said. "Planetologist." "As you wish," the Duke said. He glanced down at Paul. "Son, this is the judge of the change, the arbiter of dispute, the man set here to see that the forms are obeyed in our assumption of power over this fief." He glanced at Kynes. "And this is my son." "My lord," Kynes said. "Are you a Fremen?" Paul asked. Kynes smiled. "I am accepted in both CH and village, young master, but I am in His Majesty's service, the Imperial Planetologist." Paul nodded, impressed by the man's air of strength. Halleck had pointed Kynes out to Paul from an upper window of the administration building. "The man standing there with a Fremen escort, the one moving now toward the ornithopter." Paul had inspected Kynes briefly with binoculars, noting the prim, straight mouth, the high forehead. Halleck had spoken in Paul's ear. Odd sort of fellow. Has a precise way of speaking. Clipped off, no fuzzy edges. Razor apt. And the Duke, behind them, had said, "Scientist type." Now, only a few feet from the man, Paul sensed the power in Kynes, the impact of personality, as though he were blood royal, born to command. "I understand we have you to thank for our stillsuits and these cloaks," the Duke said. "I hope they fit well, my lord," Kynes said. "They're of Fremen make, and as near as possible the dimensions given me by your man Halleck here." "I was concerned that you said you couldn't take us into the desert unless we wore these garments," the Duke said. "We can carry plenty of water. We don't intend to be out long, and we'll have air cover. The escort you see overhead right now. It isn't likely we'd be forced down." Kynes stared at him, seeing the water-fat flesh. He spoke coldly. "You never talk of likelihoods on Arrakis. You speak only of possibilities." Halleck stiffened. "The Duke is to be addressed as my lord or sire." Later gave Halleck their private hand signal to desist, said, "Our ways are new here, Gurney. We must make allowances." "As you wish, sire." "We are indebted to you, Dr. Kynes," Leto said. "These suits and the consideration for our welfare will be remembered." On impulse, Paul called to mind a quotation from the O.C. Bible, said, "The gift is the blessing of the giver." The words rang out over-loud in the still air. The Fremen escort Kynes had left in the shade of the administration building leaped up from their squatting repose, muttering in open agitation. One cried out, "Lisan al-Gaib!" Kynes whirled, gave a curt chopping signal with a hand, waved the guard away. They fell back, grumbling among themselves, trailed away around the building. "Most interesting," Leto said. Kynes passed a hard glare over the Duke and Paul, said, "Most of the desert natives here are a superstitious lot. Pay no attention to them. They mean no harm." But he thought of the words of the legend. "They will greet you with holy words, and your gifts will be a blessing." Leto's assessment of Kynes, based partly on Hawat's brief verbal report, guarded and full of suspicions, suddenly crystallized. The man was Fremen. Kynes had come with a Fremen escort, which could mean simply that the Fremen were testing their new freedom to enter urban areas, but it had seemed an honor guard. And by his manner, Kynes was a proud man, accustomed to freedom, his tongue and his manner guarded only by his own suspicions. Paul's question had been direct and pertinent. Kynes had gone native. "Shouldn't we be going, sir?" Halleck asked. The Duke nodded. "I'll fly my own thopter. Kynes can sit up front with me to direct me. You and Paul take the rear seats." "One moment, please," Kynes said. "With your permission, sire, I must check the security of your suits." The Duke started to speak, but Kynes pressed on. "I have concern for my own flesh as well as yours, my lord. I'm well aware of whose throat would be slit, should harm befall you two while you're in my care." The Duke frowned, thinking, how delicate this moment. If I refuse, it may offend him. And this could be a man whose value to me is beyond measure. Yet, to let him inside my shield, touching my person, when I know so little about him? The thoughts flicked through his mind with decision hard on their heels. "We're in your hands," the Duke said. He stepped forward, opening his robe, saw Halleck come up on the balls of his feet, poised and alert, but remaining where he was. "And, if you'd be so kind," the Duke said, "I'd appreciate an explanation of the suit from one who lives so intimately with it." "Certainly," Kynes said. He felt up under the robe for the shoulder seals, speaking as he examined the suit. "It's basically a micro-sandwich, a high-efficiency filter and heat exchange system." He adjusted the shoulder seals. "The skin contact layer's porous. Perspiration passes through it, having cooled the body, near normal evaporation process. The next two layers," Kynes tightened the chest fit, "include heat exchange filaments and salt precipitators, salts reclaimed." The Duke lifted his arms at a gesture, said, "Most interesting." "Breathe deeply," Kynes said. The Duke obeyed. Kynes studied the underarm seals, adjusted one. "Motions of the body, especially breathing," he said, "and some osmotic action provide the pumping force." He loosened the chest fit slightly. "Reclaimed water circulates to catch pockets from which you draw it through this tube in the clip at your neck." The Duke twisted his chin in and down to look at the end of the tube. "Efficient and convenient," he said. "Good engineering." Kynes knelt, examined the leg seals. "Urine and feces are processed in the thigh pads," he said, and stood up, felt the neck fitting, lifted a sectioned flap there. "In the open desert, you wear this filter across your face. This tube in the nostrils with these plugs to ensure a tight fit. Breathe in through the mouth filter, out through the nose tube. With a Fremen suit in good working order, you won't lose more than a thimbleful of moisture a day, even if you're caught in the Great Erg." "A thimbleful a day," the Duke said. Kynes pressed a finger against the suit's forehead pad, said, "This may rub a little. If it irritates you, please tell me. I could slit-patch it a bit tighter." "My thanks," the Duke said. He moved his shoulders in the suit as Kynes stepped back, realizing that it did feel better now, tighter and less irritating. Kynes turned to Paul. "Now, let's have a look at you, lad." A good man, but he'll have to learn to address us properly, the Duke thought. Paul stood passively as Kynes inspected the suit. It had been an odd sensation, putting on the crinkling, slick-surfaced garment. In his foreconsciousness had been the absolute knowledge that he had never before worn a still-suit. Yet each motion of adjusting the adhesion tabs under Gurney's inexpert guidance had seemed natural, instinctive. When he had tightened the chest to gain maximum pumping action from the motion of breathing, he had known what he did, and why. When he had fitted the neck and forehead tabs tightly, he had known it was to prevent friction blisters. Kynes straightened, stepped back with a puzzled expression. "You've worn a still suit before?" he asked. "This is the first time." "Then someone adjusted it for you?" "No." "Your desert boots are fitted slip fashion at the ankles. Who told you to do that?" "It seemed the right way." "That it most certainly is." And Kynes rubbed his cheek, thinking of the legend. "He shall know your ways, as though born to them." "We waste time," the Duke said. He gestured to the waiting Thopter, led the way, accepting the guard's salute with a nod. He climbed in, fastened his safety harness, checked controls and instruments. The craft creaked as the others clambered aboard. Kynes fastened his harness, focused on the padded comfort of the aircraft, soft luxury of grey-green upholstery, gleaming instruments, the sensation of filtered and washed air in his lungs as doors slammed and vent fans whirred alive. So soft, he thought. "All secure, sir," Halleck said. Leto fed power to the wings, felt them cup and dip once, twice. They were airborne in 10 meters, wings feathered tightly and afterjets thrusting them upward in a steep, hissing climb. "Southeast over the shield wall," Kynes said. "That's where I told your Sandmaster to concentrate his equipment." "Right." The Duke banked into his air cover, the other craft taking up their guard positions as they headed southeast. "The design and manufacture of these still suits bespeaks a high degree of sophistication," the Duke said. "Some day I may show you a CH factory," Kynes said. "I would find that interesting," the Duke said. "I note that suits are manufactured also in some of the garrison cities." "Inferior copies," Kynes said. "Any Dune man who values his skin wears a Fremen suit." "And it'll hold your water loss to a thimbleful a day." "Properly suited, your forehead cap tight, all seals in order, your major water loss is through the palms of your hands," Kynes said. "You can wear suit gloves if you're not using your hands for critical work, but most Fremen in the open desert rub their hands with juice from the leaves of the creosote bush. It inhibits perspiration." The Duke glanced down to the left at the broken landscape of the shield wall. Chasms of tortured rock, patches of yellow-brown crossed by black lines of fault shattering. It was as though someone had dropped this ground from space and left it where it smashed. They crossed a shallow basin with a clear outline of grey sand spreading across it from a canyon opening to the south. The sand fingers ran out into the basin, a dry delta outlined against darker rock. Kynes sat back, thinking about the water-fat flesh he had felt beneath the still suits. They wore shield belts over their robes, slow pellet stunners at the waist, coin-sized emergency transmitters on cords around their necks. Both the Duke and his son carried knives in wrist sheaths, and the sheaths appeared well worn. The people struck Kynes as a strange combination of softness and armed strength. There was a poise to them totally unlike the Harkonnens. "When you report to the Emperor on the change of government here, will you say we observed the rules?" Leto asked. He glanced at Kynes, back to their course. "The Harkonnens left, you came," Kynes said. "And is everything as it should be?" Leto asked. Momentary tension showed in the tightening of a muscle along Kynes's jaw. "As planetologist and judge of the change, I am a direct subject of the Imperium, my lord." The Duke smiled grimly. "But we both know the realities." "I remind you that His Majesty supports my work." "Indeed. And what is your work?" In the brief silence, Paul thought, he's pushing this Kynes too hard. Paul glanced at Halleck, but the minstrel warrior was staring out at the barren landscape. Kynes spoke stiffly. "You, of course, refer to my duties as planetologist." "Of course." "It is mostly dry land biology and botany. Some geological work, core drilling and testing. You never really exhaust the possibilities of an entire planet." "Do you also investigate the spice?" Kynes turned, and Paul noted the hard line of the man's cheek. "A curious question, my lord." "Bear in mind, Kynes, that this is now my fief. My methods differ from those of the Harkonnens. I don't care if you study the spice as long as I share what you discover." He glanced at the planetologist. "The Harkonnens discouraged investigation of the spice, didn't they?" Kynes stared back, without answering. "You may speak plainly," the Duke said, "without fear for your skin." "The Imperial Court is indeed a long way off," Kynes muttered, and he thought, what does this water-soft invader expect? Does he think me fool enough to enlist with him? The Duke chuckled, keeping his attention on their course. I detect a sour note in your voice, sir. We've waded in here with our mob of tame killers, eh? And we expect you to realize immediately that we're different from the Harkonnens? I've seen the propaganda you flooded into Sietch and village, Kynes said. Love the good Duke. Your core of— Here now, Halleck barked. He snapped his attention away from the window, leaned forward. Paul put a hand on Halleck's arm. Gurney, the Duke said. He glanced back. This man's been long under the Harkonnens. Halleck sat back. Your man Howard's subtle, Kynes said, but his object's plain enough. Will you open those bases to us, then? The Duke asked. Kynes spoke curtly. They're His Majesty's property. They're not being used. They could be used. Does His Majesty concur? Kynes darted a hard stare at the Duke. Arrakis could be an Eden, if its rulers would look up from grubbing for spice. He didn't answer my question, the Duke thought. And he said, How is a planet to become an Eden without money? What is money? Kynes asked, if it won't buy the services you need. Ah, now, the Duke thought. And he said, We'll discuss this another time. Right now I believe we're coming to the edge of the shield wall. Do I hold the same course? The same course, Kynes muttered. Paul looked out his window. Beneath them the broken ground began to drop away in tumbled creases toward a barren rock plain and a knife-edged shelf. Beyond the shelf, fingernail crescents of dunes marched toward the horizon with here and there in the distance a dull smudge, a darker blotch to tell of something not sand. Rock outcroppings, perhaps. In the heat-addled air, Paul couldn't be sure. Are there any plants down there? Paul asked. Some, Kynes said. This latitude's life zone has mostly what we call minor water stealers, adapted to raiding each other for moisture, gobbling up the trace dew. Some parts of the desert teem with life, but all of it has learned how to survive under these rigours. If you get caught down there, you imitate that life or you die. You mean steal water from each other? Paul asked. The idea outraged him, and his voice betrayed his emotion. It's done, Kynes said, but that wasn't precisely my meaning. You see, my climate demands a special attitude toward water. You are aware of water at all times. You waste nothing that contains moisture. And the Duke thought, my climate. Come around 2 degrees more southerly, my lord, Kynes said. There's a blow coming up from the west. The Duke nodded. He had seen the billowing of tan dust there. He banked the thopter round, noting the way the escort's wings reflected milky orange from the dust-refracted light as they turned to keep pace with him. This should clear the storm's edge, Kynes said. That sand must be dangerous if you fly into it, Paul said. Will it really cut the strongest metals? At this altitude it's not sand, but dust, Kynes said. The danger is lack of visibility, turbulence, clogged intakes. We'll see actual spice mining today? Paul asked. Very likely, Kynes said. Paul sat back. He had used the questions and hyper-awareness to do what his mother called registering the person. He had Kynes now. Tone of voice, each detail of face and gesture. An unnatural folding of the left sleeve on the man's robe told him of a knife in an arm sheath. The waist bulged strangely. It was said that desert men wore a belted sash into which they tucked small necessities. Perhaps the bulges came from such a sash, certainly not from a concealed shield belt. A copper pin engraved with the likeness of a hare clasped the neck of Kynes's robe. Another smaller pin with similar likeness hung at the corner of the hood, which was thrown back over his shoulders. Halleck twisted in the seat beside Paul, reached back into the rear compartment and brought out his balisette. Kynes looked around as Halleck tuned the instrument, then returned his attention to their course. "What would you like to hear, young master?" Halleck asked. "You choose, Gurney," Paul said. Halleck bent his ear close to the sounding board, strummed a chord, and sang softly. Our fathers ate manna in the desert, in the burning places where whirlwinds came. Lord, save us from that horrible land. Save us, oh, save us, from the dry and thirsty land. Kynes glanced at the Duke, said, You do travel with a light complement of guards, my lord? Are all of them such men of many talents?
Gurney?
The Duke chuckled.
Gurney's one of a kind. I like him with me for his eyes.
His eyes miss very little. The planetologist frowned. Without missing a beat in his tune, Halleck interposed, For I am like an owl of the desert, oh! I am like an owl of the desert. The Duke reached down, brought up a microphone from the instrument panel, thumbed it to life, said, Leader to escort, Gemma. Flying object at 9 o'clock, Sector B. Did you identify it? It's merely a bird, Kynes said, and added, You have sharp eyes. The panel speaker crackled, then, Escort, Gemma. Object examined under full amplification. It's a large bird. Paul looked in the indicated direction, saw the distant speck, a dot of intermittent motion, and realized how keyed up his father must be. Every sense was at full alert. I'd not realized there were birds that large, this far into the desert, the Duke said. That's likely an eagle, Kynes said. Many creatures have adapted to this place. The ornithopter swept over a bare rock plain. Paul looked down from their 2,000 meters altitude, saw the wrinkled shadow of their craft and escort. The land beneath seemed flat, but shadow wrinkles said otherwise. Has anyone ever walked out of the desert? The Duke asked. Halleck's music stopped. He leaned forward to catch the answer. Not from the deep desert, Kynes said. Men have walked out of the second zone several times. They've survived by crossing the rock areas where worms seldom go. The timbre of Kynes's voice held Paul's attention. He felt his senses come alert, the way they were trained to do. Ah, the worms, the Duke said. I must see one sometime. You may see one today, Kynes said. Wherever there is spice, there are worms. Always? Halleck asked. Always. Is there a relationship between worm and spice? The Duke asked. Kynes turned, and Paul saw the pursed lips as the man spoke. They defend spice sands. Each worm has a territory. As to the spice, who knows? Worm specimens we've examined lead us to suspect complicated chemical interchanges within them. We find traces of hydrochloric acid in the ducts, more complicated acid forms elsewhere. I'll give you my monograph on the subject. And a shield's no defense? The Duke asked. Shields? Kynes sneered. Activate a shield within the worm zone and seal your fate. Worms ignore territory lines, come from far around to attack a shield. No man wearing a shield has ever survived such attack. How are worms taken, then? High-voltage electrical shock applied separately to each ring segment is the only known way of killing and preserving an entire worm, Kynes said. They can be stunned and shattered by explosives, but each ring segment has a life of its own. Barring atomics, I know of no explosive powerful enough to destroy a large worm entirely. They're incredibly tough. Why hasn't an effort been made to wipe them out? Paul asked. Too expensive, Kynes said. Too much area to cover. Paul leaned back in his corner. His truth sense, awareness of tone shadings, told him that Kynes was lying and telling half-truths, and he thought, if there's a relationship between spice and worms, killing the worms would destroy the spice. No one will have to walk out of the desert soon, the Duke said. Trip these little transmitters at our necks and rescue is on its way. All our workers will be wearing them before long. We're setting up a special rescue service. Very commendable, Kynes said. Your tone says you don't agree, the Duke said. Agree? Of course I agree, but it won't be much use. Static electricity from sandstorms masks out many signals. Transmitters short out. They've been tried here before, you know. Arrakis is tough on equipment. And if a worm's hunting you, there's not much time. Frequently you have no more than 15 or 20 minutes. What would you advise? The Duke asked. You ask my advice? As planetologist, yes. You'd follow my advice? If I found it sensible. Very well, my lord. Never travel alone. The Duke turned his attention from the controls. That's all? That's all. Never travel alone. What if you're separated by a storm and forced down? Halleck asked. Isn't there anything you could do? Anything covers much territory, Kynes said. What would you do? Paul asked. Kynes turned a hard stare at the boy, brought his attention back to the Duke. I'd remember to protect the integrity of my stillsuit. If I were outside the worm zone, or in rock, I'd stay with the ship. If I were down in open sand, I'd get away from the ship as fast as I could. About 1,000 meters would be far enough. Then I'd hide beneath my robe. A worm would get the ship, but it might miss me. Then what? Halleck asked. Kynes shrugged. Wait for the worm to leave. That's all? Paul asked. When the worm has gone, one may try to walk out, Kynes said. You must walk softly. Avoid drum sands, tidal dust basins. Head for the nearest rock zone. There are many such zones. You might make it. Drum sand? Halleck asked. A condition of sand compaction, Kynes said. The slightest step sets it drumming. Worms always come to that. And a tidal dust basin? The Duke asked. Certain depressions in the desert are filled with dust over the centuries. They are so vast they have currents and tides. All will swallow the unwary who step into them. Halleck sat back, resumed strumming the baliset. Presently he sang, Wild beasts of the desert do hunt there, waiting for the innocents to pass. Oh, tempt not the gods of the desert, lest you seek a lonely epitaph. The perils of the— He broke off, leaned forward. Dust cloud ahead, sire. I see it, Gurney. That's what we seek, Kynes said. Paul stretched up in the seat to peer ahead. Saw a rolling yellow cloud low on the desert surface some 30 kilometers ahead. One of your factory crawlers, Kynes said. It's on the surface, and that means it's on spice. The cloud is vented sand being expelled after the spice has been centrifugally removed. There's no other cloud quite like it. Aircraft over it, the Duke said. I see 2, 3, 4 spotters, Kynes said. They're watching for worm sign. Worm sign? The Duke asked. A sand wave moving toward the crawler. They'll have seismic probes on the surface, too. Worms sometimes travel too deep for the wave to show. Kynes swung his gaze around the sky. Should be a carry-all wing around, but I don't see it. A worm always comes, eh? Halleck asked. Always. Paul leaned forward, touched Kynes' shoulder. How big an area does each worm stake out? Kynes frowned. The child kept asking adult questions. That depends on the size of the worm. What's the variation? The Duke asked. Big ones may control 300 or 400 square kilometers. Small ones— He broke off as the Duke kicked on the jet brakes. The ship bucked as its tail pods whispered to silence. Stub wings elongated, cupped the air. The craft became a full thopter as the Duke banked it, holding the wings to a gentle beat, pointing with his left hand off to the east, beyond the factory crawler. Is that worm sign? Kynes leaned across the Duke to peer into the distance. Paul and Halleck were crowded together, looking in the same direction, and Paul noted that their escort, caught by the sudden manoeuvre, had surged ahead, but now was curving back. The factory crawler lay ahead of them, still some 3 kilometers away. Where the Duke pointed, crescent dune tracks spread shadow ripples toward the horizon, and running through them as a level line stretching into the distance came an elongated mount in motion, a cresting of sand. It reminded Paul of the way a big fish disturbed the water when swimming just under the surface. Worm, Kynes said. Big one. He leaned back, grabbed the microphone from the panel, punched out a new frequency selection. Glancing at the grid chart on rollers over their heads, he spoke into the microphone. Calling crawler at Delta Ajax 9er. Worm sign warning. Crawler at Delta Ajax 9er. Worm sign warning. Acknowledge, please. He waited. The panel speaker emitted static crackles, then a voice. "Who calls Delta Ajax 9 Over?" "They seem pretty calm about it," Halleck said. Kynes spoke into the microphone. "Unlisted flight, north and east of you about 3 kilometers. Worm sign is on intercept course, your position, estimated contact 25 minutes. Another voice rumbled from the speaker. "This is Spotter Control, sighting confirmed, stand by for contact fix." There was a pause, then, "Contact in 26 minutes minus. That was a sharp estimate. Who's on that unlisted flight, over?" Halleck had his harness off and surged forward between Kynes and the Duke. "Is this the regular working frequency, Kynes?" "Yes. Why?" "Who'd be listening?" "Just the work areas in this area. Cuts down interference." Again the speaker crackled, then, "This is Delta Ajax 9 Who gets bonus credit for that spot? Over." Halleck glanced at the Duke. Kynes said, "There's a bonus based on spice load for whoever gives first worm warning. They want to know—" "Tell them who had first sight of that worm," Halleck said. The Duke nodded. Kynes hesitated, then lifted the microphone. "Spotter credit to the Duke Leto Atreides. The Duke Leto Atreides, over." The voice from the speaker was flat and partly distorted by a burst of static. "We read and thank you." "Now, tell them to divide the bonus among themselves," Halleck ordered. "Tell them it's the Duke's wish." Kynes took a deep breath, then, "It's the Duke's wish that you divide the bonus among your crew. Do you read? Over?" "Acknowledged and thank you," the speaker said. The Duke said, "I forgot to mention that Gurney is also very talented in public relations." Kynes turned a puzzled frown on Halleck. "This lets the men know their Duke is concerned for their safety," Halleck said. "Word will get around. It was on an area working frequency, not likely Harkonnen agents heard." He glanced out at their air cover. "And we're a pretty strong force. It was a good risk." The Duke banked their craft toward the sand cloud erupting from the factory crawler. "What happens now?" "There's a carryall wing somewhere close," Kynes said. "It'll come in and lift off the crawler." "What if the carryall's wrecked?" Halleck asked. "Some equipment is lost," Kynes said. "Get in close over the crawler, my lord. You'll find this interesting." The Duke scowled, busied himself with the controls as they came into turbulent air over the crawler. Paul looked down, saw sand still spewing out of the metal and plastic monster beneath them. It looked like a great tan and blue beetle with many wide tracks extending on arms around it. He saw a giant inverted funnel snout poked into dark sand in front of it. "Rich spice bed by the colour," Kynes said. "They'll continue working until the last minute." The Duke fed more power to the wings, stiffened them for a steeper descent as he settled lower in a circling glide above the crawler. A glance left and right showed his cover holding altitude and circling overhead. Paul studied the yellow cloud belching from the crawler's pipe vents, looked out over the desert at the approaching worm track. "Shouldn't we be hearing them call in the carryall?" Halleck asked. "They usually have the wing on a different frequency," Kynes said. "Shouldn't they have 2 carryalls standing by for every crawler?" the Duke asked. "There should be 26 men on that machine down there, not to mention cost of equipment." Kynes said, "You don't have enough He broke off as the speaker erupted with an angry voice. "Any of you see the wing? He isn't answering." A garble of noise crackled from the speaker, drowned in an abrupt override signal, then silence, and the first voice. "Report by the numbers, over." "This is Spotter Control. Last I saw the wing was pretty high and circling off northwest. I don't see him now, over." "Spotter 1, negative, over." "Spotter 2, negative, over." "Spotter 3, negative, over." Silence. The Duke looked down. His own craft's shadow was just passing over the crawler. "Only 4 spotters, is that right?" "Correct," Kynes said. "There are 5 in our party," the Duke said. "Our ships are larger. We can crowd in 3 extra each. Their spotters ought to be able to lift off 2 each." Paul did the mental arithmetic, said, "That's 3 short." "Why don't they have 2 carryalls to each crawler?" bucked the Duke. "You don't have enough extra equipment," Kynes said. "All the more reason we should protect what we have." "Where could that carryall go?" Halleck asked. "Could have been forced down somewhere out of sight," Kynes said. The Duke grabbed the microphone, hesitated, with thumb poised over its switch. How could they lose sight of a carryall? They keep their attention on the ground, looking for worm sign, Kynes said. The Duke thumbed the switch, spoke into the microphone. This is your Duke. We are coming down to take off Delta Ajax 9's crew. All spotters are ordered to comply. Spotters will land on the east side. We will take the west. Over. He reached down, punched out his own command frequency, repeated the order for his own air cover, handed the microphone back to Kynes. Kynes returned to the working frequency, and a voice blasted from the speaker. Almost a full load of spice! We have almost a full load! We can't leave that for a damned worm! Over! Damn the spice! The Duke barked. He grabbed back the microphone, said, We can always get more spice. There are seats in our ships for all but 3 of you. Draw straws or decide any way you like who's to go. But you're going, and that's an order. He slammed the microphone back into Kynes's hands, muttered, Sorry, as Kynes shook an injured finger. How much time? Paul asked. 9 minutes, Kynes said. The Duke said, This ship has more power than the others. If we took off under jet with 3/4 wings, we could crowd in an additional man. That sounds soft, Kynes said. With 4 extra men aboard on a jet takeoff, we could snap the wings, sire, Halleck said. Not on this ship, the Duke said. He hauled back on the controls as the Thopter glided in beside the crawler. The wings tipped up, braked the Thopter to a skidding stop within 20 meters of the factory. The crawler was silent now, no sand spouting from its vents. Only a faint mechanical rumble issued from it, becoming more audible as the Duke opened his door. Immediately their nostrils were assailed by the odor of cinnamon, heavy and pungent. With a loud flapping, the spotter aircraft glided down to the sand on the other side of the crawler. The Duke's own escort swooped in to land in line with him. Paul, looking out at the factory, saw how all the Thopters were dwarfed by it, gnats beside a warrior beetle. Gurney, you and Paul toss out that rear seat, the Duke said. He manually cranked the wings out to 3/4, set their angle, checked the jet pod controls. Why the devil aren't they coming out of that machine? They're hoping the carryall will show up, Kynes said. They still have a few minutes. He glanced off to the east. All turned to look the same direction, seeing no sign of the worm, but there was a heavy, charged feeling of anxiety in the air. The Duke took the microphone, punched for his command frequency, said, 2 of you toss out your shield generators. By the numbers. You can carry 1 more man that way. We're not leaving any men for that monster. He keyed back to the working frequency, barked, All right, you and Delta Ajax 9er, out, now! This is a command from your Duke. On the double, or I'll cut that crawler apart with a laser gun. A hatch snapped open near the front of the factory, another at the rear, another at the top. Men came tumbling out, sliding and scrambling down to the sand. A tall man in a patched working robe was the last to emerge. He jumped down to a track and then to the sand. The Duke hung the microphone on the panel, swung out onto the wing step, shouted, 2 men each into your spotters! The man in the patched robe began tolling off pairs of his crew, pushing them toward the craft waiting on the other side. 4 over here, the Duke shouted. 4 into that ship back there. He jabbed a finger at an escort Thopter directly behind him. The guards were just wrestling the shield generator out of it. And 4 into that ship over there. He pointed to the other escort that had shed its shield generator. 3 each into the others. Run, you sand dogs! The tall man finished counting off his crew, came slogging across the sand, followed by 3 of his companions. I hear the worm, but I can't see it, Kynes said. The others heard it then, an abrasive slithering, distant and growing louder. Damn sloppy way to operate, the Duke muttered. Aircraft began flapping off the sand around them. It reminded the Duke of a time in his home planet's jungles, a sudden emergence into a clearing and carrion birds lifting away from the carcass of a wild ox. The spice workers slogged up to the side of the Thopter, started climbing in behind the Duke. Halleck helped, dragging them into the rear. In you go, boys, he snapped. On a double. Paul, crowded into a corner by sweating men, smelled the perspiration of fear, saw that 2 of the men had poor neck adjustments on their still suits. He filed the information in his memory for future action. His father would have to order tighter stillsuit discipline. Men tended to become sloppy if you didn't watch such things. The last man came gasping into the rear, said, "A worm! It's almost on us! Blast off!" The Duke slid into his seat, frowning, said, "We still have almost 3 minutes on the original contact estimate. Is that right, Kynes?" He shut his door, checked it. "Almost exactly, my lord," Kynes said. And he thought, a cool one, this Duke. "All secure here, sir," Halleck said. The Duke nodded, watched the last of his escort take off. He adjusted the igniter, glanced once more at wings and instruments, punched the jet sequence. The takeoff pressed the Duke and Kynes deep into their seats, compressed the people in the rear. Kynes watched the way the Duke handled the controls, gently, surely. The Thopter was fully airborne now, and the Duke studied his instruments, glanced left and right at his wings. "She's very heavy, sir," Halleck said. "Well within the tolerances of this ship," the Duke said. "You didn't really think I'd risk this cargo, did you, Gurney?" Halleck grinned, said, "Not a bit of it, sir." The Duke banked his craft in a long, easy curve, climbing over the crawler. Paul, crushed into a corner beside a window, stared down at the silent machine on the sand. The worm sign had broken off about 400 meters from the crawler, and now there appeared to be turbulence in the sand around the factory. "The worm is now beneath the crawler," Kynes said. "You are about to witness a thing few have seen." Flecks of dust shadowed the sand around the crawler now. The big machine began to tip down to the right. A gigantic sand whirlpool began forming there to the right of the crawler. It moved faster and faster. Sand and dust filled the air now for hundreds of meters around. Then they saw it. A wide hole emerged from the sand. Sunlight flashed from glistening white spokes within it. The hole's diameter was at least twice the length of the crawler, Paul estimated. He watched as the machine slid into that opening in a billow of dust and sand. The hole pulled back. "Gods, what a monster," muttered a man beside Paul. "Got all our flogging spice," growled another. "Someone is going to pay for this," the Duke said. "I promise you that." By the very flatness of his father's voice, Paul sensed the deep anger. He found that he shared it. This was criminal waste. In the silence that followed, they heard Kynes. "Bless the Maker and his water," Kynes murmured. "Bless the coming and going of him. May his passage cleanse the world. May he keep the world for his people." "What's that you're saying?" the Duke asked. But Kynes remained silent. Paul glanced at the men crowded around him. They were staring fearfully at the back of Kynes's head. One of them whispered, "Liet." Kynes turned, scowling. The man sank back, abashed. Another of the rescued men began coughing, dry and rasping. Presently he gasped, "Curse this hell-hole!" The tall dune man who had come last out of the crawler said, "Be you still, Cos. You but worsen your cough." He stirred among the men until he could look through them at the back of the Duke's head. "You be the Duke Leto, I warrant," he said. "It's to you we give thanks for our lives. We were ready to end it there until you came along." "Quiet, man, and let the Duke fly this ship," Halleck muttered. Paul glanced at Halleck. He, too, had seen the tension wrinkles at the corner of his father's jaw. One walked softly when the Duke was in a rage. Later began easing his Thopter out of its great banking circle, stopped at a new sign of movement on the sand. The worm had withdrawn into the depths, and now, near where the crawler had been, two figures could be seen moving north, away from the sand depression. They appeared to glide over the surface with hardly a lifting of dust to mark their passage. "Who's that down there?" the Duke barked. "Two Johnnies who came along for the ride, sir," said the tall dune man. "Why wasn't something said about them?" "It was a chance they took, sir," the dune man said. "My lord," said Kynes, "these men know it's of little use to do anything about men trapped on the desert in worm country." "We'll send a ship from base for them," the Duke snapped. "As you wish, my lord," Kynes said. "But likely when the ship gets here,
there'll be no one to rescue.
We'll send a ship anyway, the Duke said.
They were right beside where the worm came up, Paul said. How'd they escape?
The sides of the hole cave in and make the distances deceptive, Kynes said.
You waste fuel here, sir, Halleck ventured.
Aye, Gurney.
The Duke brought his craft around toward the shield wall. His escort came down from circling stations, took up positions above and on both sides. Paul thought about what the Dune man and Kynes had said. He sensed half-truths, outright lies. The men on the sand had glided across the surface so surely, moving in a way obviously calculated to keep from luring the worm back out of its depths. Fremen, Paul thought. Who else would be so sure on the sand? Who else might be left out of your worries as a matter of course, because they are in no danger? They know how to live here. They know how to outwit the worm. What were Fremen doing on that crawler? Paul asked. Kynes whirled. The tall Dune man turned wide eyes on Paul, blue within blue within blue.
Who be this lad?
He asked. Halleck moved to place himself between the man and Paul, said,
This is Paul Atreides, the ducal heir.
Why says he there were Fremen on our Rambler? The man asked. They fit the description, Paul said. Kynes snorted. You can't tell Fremen just by looking at them. He looked at the Dune man. You, who were those men?
Friends of one of the others, the Dune man said.
Just friends from a village, who wanted to see the spice sands. Kynes turned away. Fremen. But he was remembering the words of the legend. The Lisan al-Gaib shall see through all subterfuge.
They be dead now, most likely, young Sur, the Dune man said. We should not speak unkindly on them.
But Paul heard the falsehood in their voices, felt the menace that had brought Halleck instinctively into guarding position. Paul spoke dryly. A terrible place for them to die. Without turning, Kynes said, When God hath ordained a creature to die in a particular place, he causeth that creature's wants to direct him to that place. Leto turned a hard stare at Kynes. And Kynes, returning the stare, found himself troubled by a fact he had observed here. This Duke was concerned more over the men than he was over the spice. He risked his own life and that of his son to save the men. He passed off the loss of a spice crawler with a gesture. The threat to men's lives had him in a rage. A leader such as that would command fanatic loyalty. He would be difficult to defeat. Against his own will and all previous judgments, Kynes admitted to himself, I like this Duke.
Greatness is a transitory experience. It is never consistent. It depends in part upon the myth-making imagination of humankind. The person who experiences greatness must have a feeling for the myth he is in. He must reflect what is projected upon him, and he must have a strong sense of the sardonic. This is what uncouples him from belief in his own pretensions. The sardonic is all that permits him to move within himself. Without this quality, even occasional greatness will destroy a man. From Collected Sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
In the dining hall of the Arakeen Great House, suspenser lamps had been lighted against the early dark. They cast their yellow glows upward onto the black bull's head with its bloody horns, and onto the darkly glistening oil painting of the old Duke. Beneath these talismans, white linen shone around the burnished reflections of the Atreides silver, which had been placed in precise arrangements along the great table, little archipelagos of service waiting behind crystal glasses, each setting squared off before a heavy wooden chair. The classic central chandelier remained unlighted, and its chain twisted upward into shadows where the mechanism of the poison snooper had been concealed. Pausing in the doorway to inspect the arrangements, the Duke thought about the poison snooper and what it signified in his society. All of a pattern, he thought. You can plumb us by our language, the precise and delicate delineations for ways to administer treacherous death. Will someone try Chowmurky tonight, poison in the drink? Or will it be Chalmers, poison in the food? He shook his head. Beside each plate on the long table stood a flagon of water. There was enough water along the table, the Duke estimated, to keep a poor Arakeen family for more than a year. Flanking the doorway in which he stood were broad laving basins of ornate yellow and green tile. Each basin had its rack of towels. It was the custom, the housekeeper had explained, for guests as they entered to dip their hands ceremoniously into a basin, slop several cups of water onto the floor, dry their hands on a towel, and fling the towel into the growing puddle at the door. After the dinner, beggars gathered outside to get the water squeezings from the towels. How typical of a Harkonnen fief, the Duke thought. Every degradation of the spirit that can be conceived. He took a deep breath, feeling rage tighten his stomach. "The custom stops here," he muttered. He saw a serving woman, one of the old and gnarled ones the housekeeper had recommended, hovering at the doorway from the kitchen across from him. The Duke signalled with upraised hand. She moved out of the shadows, scurried around the table toward him, and he noted the leathery face, the blue within blue eyes. "My lord wishes?" She kept her head bowed, eyes shielded. He gestured. "Have these basins and towels removed." "But, nobleborn—" She looked up, mouth gaping. "I know the custom," he barked. "Take these basins to the front door. While we're eating and until we've finished, each beggar who calls may have a full cup of water. Understood?" Her leathery face displayed a twisting of emotions. Dismay, anger. With sudden insight, later realized that she must have planned to sell the water squeezings from the foot-trampled towels, wringing a few coppers from the wretches who came to the door. Perhaps that also was a custom. His face clouded, and he growled, "I'm posting a guard to see that my orders are carried out to the letter." He whirled, strode back down the passage to the great hall. Memories rolled in his mind like the toothless mutterings of old women. He remembered open water and waves, days of grass instead of sand, dazed summers that had whipped past him like windstorm leaves, all gone. "I'm getting old," he thought. "I've felt the cold hand of my mortality." And in what? An old woman's greed. In the great hall, the Lady Jessica was the centre of a mixed group standing in front of the fireplace. An open blaze crackled there, casting flickers of orange light onto jewels and laces and costly fabrics. He recognized in the group a still-suit manufacturer down from Carthage, an electronics equipment importer, a water shipper whose summer mansion was near his polar cap factory, a representative of the Guild Bank. Lean and remote, that one. A dealer in replacement parts for spice mining equipment, a thin and hard-faced woman whose escort service for off-planet visitors reputedly operated as cover for various smuggling, spying, and blackmail operations. Most of the women in the hall seemed cast from a specific type. Decorative, precisely turned out, an odd mingling of untouchable sensuousness. Even without her position as hostess, Jessica would have dominated the group, he thought. She wore no jewellery and had chosen warm colours, a long dress almost the shade of the open blaze, and an earth-brown band around her bronzed hair. He realised she had done this to taunt him subtly, a reproof against his recent pose of coldness. She was well aware that he liked her best in these shades, that he saw her as a rustling of warm colours. Nearby, more an outflanker than a member of the group, stood Duncan Idaho in glittering dress uniform, flat face unreadable, the curling black hair neatly combed. He had been summoned back from the Fremen and had his orders from Hawat. "Under pretext of guarding her, you will keep the Lady Jessica under constant surveillance." The Duke glanced around the room. There was Paul in the corner, surrounded by a fawning group of the younger Arakeen richesse, and aloof among them, 3 officers of the house troop. The Duke took particular note of the young women. What a catch a ducal heir would make. But Paul was treating all equally with an air of reserved nobility. He'll wear the title well, the Duke thought, and realized with a sudden chill that this was another death thought. Paul saw his father in the doorway, avoided his eyes. He looked around at the clusterings of guests, the jewelled hands clutching drinks, and the unobtrusive inspections with tiny, remote-cast snoopers. Seeing all the chattering faces, Paul was suddenly repelled by them. They were cheap masks locked on festering thoughts, voices gabbling to drown out the loud silence in every breast. "I'm in a sour mood," he thought, and wondered what Gurney would say to that. He knew his mood's source. He hadn't wanted to attend this function, but his father had been firm. "You have a place, a position to uphold. You're old enough to do this. You're almost a man." Paul saw his father emerge from the doorway, inspect the room, then cross to the group around the Lady Jessica. As Leto approached Jessica's group, the water shipper was asking, "Is it true the Duke will put in weather control?" From behind the man, the Duke said, "We haven't gone that far in our thinking, sir." The man turned, exposing a bland, round face, darkly tanned. "Ah, the Duke," he said. "We missed you." Leto glanced at Jessica. "A thing needed doing." He returned his attention to the water shipper, explained what he had ordered for the laving basins, adding, "As far as I'm concerned, the old custom ends now." "Is this a ducal order, my lord?" the man asked. "I leave that to your own, conscience," the Duke said. He turned, noting Kynes come up to the group. One of the women said, "I think it's a very generous gesture, giving water to the—" Someone shushed her. The Duke looked at Kynes, noting that the planetologist wore an old-style dark brown uniform with epaulets of the Imperial Civil Servant and a tiny gold teardrop of rank at his collar. The water shipper asked in an angry voice, "Does the Duke imply criticism of our custom?" "The custom has been changed," Leto said. He nodded to Kynes, marked the frown on Jessica's face, thought, "A frown does not become her, but it'll increase rumours of friction between us." "With the Duke's permission," the water shipper asked, "I'd like to inquire further about customs." Leto heard the sudden, oily tone in the man's voice, noted the watchful silence in this group, the way heads were beginning to turn toward them around the room. "Isn't it almost time for dinner?" Jessica asked. "But our guest has some questions," Leto said. And he looked at the water shipper, seeing a round-faced man with large eyes and thick lips, recalling Howat's memorandum. "And this water shipper is a man to watch. Lingar Butte, remember the name? The Harkonnens used him, but never fully controlled him." "Water customs are so interesting," Butte said, and there was a smile on his face. "I'm curious what you intend about the conservatory attached to this house. Do you intend to continue flaunting it in the people's faces, my lord?" Leto held anger in check, staring at the man. Thoughts raced through his mind. It had taken bravery to challenge him in his own ducal castle, especially since they now had Butte's signature over a contract of allegiance. The action had taken, also, a knowledge of personal power. Water was, indeed, power here. If water facilities were mined, for instance, ready to be destroyed at a signal. The man looked capable of such a thing. Destruction of water facilities might well destroy Arrakis. That could well have been the club this Butte held over the Harkonnens. "My lord, the Duke and I have other plans for our conservatory," Jessica said. She smiled at Leto. "We intend to keep it, certainly, but only to hold it in trust for the people of Arrakis. It is our dream that someday the climate of Arrakis may be changed sufficiently to grow such plants anywhere in the open." Bless her, Leto thought. Let our water shipper chew on that. "Your interest in water and weather control is obvious," the Duke said. "I'd advise you to diversify your holdings. One day, water will not be a precious commodity on Arrakis." And he thought, Howat must redouble his efforts at infiltrating this Butte's organization. and we must start on standby water facilities at once. No man is going to hold a club over my head." Butte nodded, the smile still on his face. "A commendable dream, my lord." He withdrew a pace. Leiter's attention was caught by the expression on Kynes's face. The man was staring at Jessica. He appeared transfigured, like a man in love, or caught in a religious trance. Kynes's thoughts were overwhelmed at last by the words of prophecy, "And they shall share your most precious dream." He spoke directly to Jessica. "Do you bring the shortening of the way?" "Ah, Dr. Kynes," the water shipper said. "You've come in from tramping around with your mobs of Fremen. How gracious of you." Kynes passed an unreadable glance across Butte, said, "It is said in the desert that possession of water in great amount can inflict a man with fatal carelessness." "They have many strange sayings in the desert," Butte said, but his voice betrayed uneasiness. Jessica crossed to Leto, slipped her hand under his arm to gain a moment in which to calm herself. Kynes had said, "the shortening of the way." In the old tongue, the phrase translated as Kwisatz Haderach. The planetologist's odd question seemed to have gone unnoticed by the others, and now Kynes was bending over one of the consort women, listening to a low-voiced coquetry. Kwisatz Haderach, Jessica thought. Did our Missionaria Protectiva plant that legend here too? The thought fanned her secret hope for Paul. He could be the Kwisatz Haderach. He could be. The Guild Bank representative had fallen into conversation with the water shipper, and Butte's voice lifted above the renewed hum of conversations. "Many people have sought to change Arrakis." The Duke saw how the words seemed to pierce Kynes, jerking the planetologist upright and away from the flirting woman. In the sudden silence, a house trooper in uniform of a footman cleared his throat behind Leto, said, "Dinner is served, my lord." The Duke directed a questioning glance down at Jessica. "The custom here is for host and hostess to follow their guests to table," she said, and smiled. "Shall we change that one too, my lord?" He spoke coldly. "That seems a goodly custom. We shall let it stand for now." "The illusion that I suspect her of treachery must be maintained," he thought. He glanced at the guests filing past them. "Who among you believes this lie?" Jessica, sensing his remoteness, wondered at it as she had done frequently the past week. "He acts like a man struggling with himself," she thought. "Is it because I moved so swiftly, setting up this dinner party? Yet he knows how important it is that we begin to mix our officers and men with the locals on a social plane. We are father and mother surrogate to them all. Nothing impresses that fact more firmly than this sort of social sharing." Leto watched the guests file past, recalled what Thufir Hawat had said when informed of the affair. "Sire, I forbid it!" A grim smile touched the Duke's mouth. What a scene that had been! And when the Duke had remained adamant about attending the dinner, Hawat had shaken his head. "I have bad feelings about this, my lord," he'd said. "Things move too swiftly on Arrakis. That's not like the Harkonnens. Not like them at all." Paul passed his father escorting a young woman half a head taller than himself. He shot a sour glance at his father, nodded at something the young woman said. "Her father manufactures still suits," Jessica said. "I'm told that only a fool would be caught in the deep desert wearing one of the man's suits." "Who's the man with the scarred face ahead of Paul?" the Duke asked. "I don't place him." "A late addition to the list," she whispered. "Gurney arranged the invitation. Smuggler." "Gurney arranged?" "At my request. It was cleared with Hawat, although I thought Hawat was a little stiff about it. The smuggler's called Tuek. Esma Tuek. He's a power among his kind. They all know him here. He's dined at many of the houses." "Why is he here?" "Everyone here will ask that question," she said. "Tuek will sow doubt and suspicion just by his presence. He'll also serve notice that you're prepared to back up your orders against graft by enforcement from the smuggler's end as well. This was the point Howard appeared to like." "I'm not sure I like it." He nodded to a passing couple, saw only a few of their guests remained to precede them.
"Why didn't you invite some Fremen?"
"There's Kynes," she said.
"Yes, there's Kynes," he said.
"Have you arranged any other little surprises for me?" He led her into step behind the procession. "All else is most conventional," she said. And she thought, "My darling, can't you see that this smuggler controls fast ships, that he can be bribed? We must have a way out, a door of escape from Arrakis, if all else fails us here." As they emerged into the dining hall, she disengaged her arm, allowed Leto to seat her. He strode to his end of the table. A footman held his chair for him. The others settled with a swishing of fabrics, a scraping of chairs, but the Duke remained standing. He gave a hand signal, and the house troopers in footman uniform around the table stepped back, standing at attention. Uneasy silence settled over the room. Jessica, looking down the length of the table, saw a faint trembling at the corners of Leto's mouth, noted the dark flush of anger on his cheeks. What has angered him? She asked herself. Surely not my invitation to the smuggler.
"Some question my changing of the laving basin custom," Leto said. "This is my way of telling you that many things will change."
Embarrassed silence settled over the table. They think him drunk, Jessica thought. Leto lifted his water flagon, held it aloft where the suspensor lights shot beams of reflection off it.
"As a chevalier of the Imperium, then," he said, "I give you a toast."
The others grasped their flagons, all eyes focused on the Duke. In the sudden stillness, a suspensor light drifted slightly in the errant breeze from the serving kitchen hallway. Shadows played across the Duke's hawk features.
"Here I am, and here I remain," he barked.
There was an abortive movement of flagons toward mouths, stopped as the Duke remained with arm upraised.
"My toast is one of those maxims so dear to our hearts. Business makes progress. Fortune passes everywhere."
He sipped his water. The others joined him. Questioning glances passed among them.
"Gurney!"
the Duke called. From an alcove at Leto's end of the room came Halleck's voice.
"Here, my lord. Give us a tune, Gurney."
A minor chord from the balisette floated out of the alcove. Servants began putting plates of food on the table, at the Duke's gesture releasing them. Roast desert hare in sauce cepeda, oplamage Syrian, chuka under glass, coffee with melange. A rich cinnamon odour from the spice wafted across the table. A true pot-à-rouille served with sparkling Caradan wine. Still, the Duke remained standing. As the guests waited, their attention torn between the dishes placed before them and the standing Duke, Leto said,
"In olden times it was the duty of the host to entertain his guests with his own talents."
His knuckles turned white, so fiercely did he grip his water flagon.
"I cannot sing, but I give you the words of Gurney's song. Consider it another toast, a toast to all who've died bringing us to this station."
An uncomfortable stirring sounded around the table. Jessica lowered her gaze, glanced at the people seated nearest her. There was the round-faced water shipper and his woman, the pale and austere Guild Bank representative. He seemed a whistle-faced scarecrow, with his eyes fixed on Leto. The rugged and scar-faced Tuek, his blue-within-blue eyes downcast.
"Review, friends, troops long past review," the Duke intoned. "All to fate a weight of pains and dollars. Their spirits wear our silver collars. Review, friends, troops long past review. Each a dot of time without pretence or guile. With them passes the lure of fortune. Review, friends, troops long past review. When our time ends on its rictus smile, we'll pass the lure of fortune."
The Duke allowed his voice to trail off on the last line, took a deep drink from his water flagon, slammed it back onto the table. Water slopped over the brim onto the linen. The others drank in embarrassed silence. Again the Duke lifted his water flagon, and this time emptied its remaining half onto the floor, knowing that the others around the table must do the same. Jessica was first to follow his example. There was a frozen moment before the others began emptying their flagons. Jessica saw how Paul, seated near his father, was studying the reactions around him. She found herself also fascinated by what her guests' actions revealed, especially among the women. This was clean, potable water, not something already cast away in a sopping towel. Reluctance to just discard it exposed itself in trembling hands, delayed reactions, nervous laughter, and violent obedience to the necessity. One woman dropped her flagon, looked the other way as her male companion recovered it. Kynes, though, caught her attention most sharply. The planetologist hesitated, then emptied his flagon into a container beneath his jacket. He smiled at Jessica as he caught her watching him, raised the empty flagon to her in a silent toast. He appeared completely unembarrassed by his action. Halleck's music still wafted over the room, but it had come out of its minor key, lilting and lively now as though he were trying to lift the mood. "Let the dinner commence," the Duke said, and sank into his chair. He's angry and uncertain, Jessica thought. The loss of that factory crawler hit him more deeply than it should have. It must be something more than that loss. He acts like a desperate man. She lifted her fork, hoping in the motion to hide her own sudden bitterness. Why not? He is desperate. Slowly at first, then with increasing animation, the dinner got under way. The stillsuit manufacturer complimented Jessica on her chef and wine. "We brought both from Caladan," she said. "Superb," he said, tasting the chuka. "Simply superb, and not a hint of melange in it. One gets so tired of the spice in everything." The Guild Bank representative looked across at Kynes. "I understand, Dr. Kynes, that another factory crawler has been lost to a worm." "News travels fast," the Duke said. "Then it's true?" the banker asked, shifting his attention to Leto. "Of course it's true," the Duke snapped. "The blasted carryall disappeared. It shouldn't be possible for anything that big to disappear." "When the worm came, there was nothing to recover the crawler," Kynes said. "It should not be possible," the Duke repeated. "No one saw the carryall leave?" the banker asked. "Spotters customarily keep their eyes on the sand," Kynes said. "They're primarily interested in worm sign. A carryall's complement usually is 4 men, 2 pilots and 2 journeymen attachers. If 1 or even 2 of this crew were in the pay of the Duke's foes—" "Ah, I see," the banker said. "And you, as judge of the change, do you challenge this?" "I shall have to consider my position carefully," Kynes said. "And I certainly will not discuss it at table." And he thought, that pale skeleton of a man. He knows this is the kind of infraction I was instructed to ignore. The banker smiled, returned his attention to his food. Jessica sat remembering a lecture from her Bene Gesserit school days. The subject had been espionage and counter-espionage. A plump, happy-faced Reverend Mother had been the lecturer, her jolly voice contrasting weirdly with the subject matter. "A thing to note about any espionage and or counter-espionage school is the similar basic reaction pattern of all its graduates. Any enclosed discipline sets its stamp, its pattern, upon its students. That pattern is susceptible to analysis and prediction. Now, motivational patterns are going to be similar among all espionage agents. That is to say, there will be certain types of motivation that are similar despite differing schools or opposed aims. You will study first how to separate this element for your analysis. In the beginning, through interrogation patterns that betray the inner orientation of the interrogators. Secondly, by close observation of language-thought orientation of those under analysis. You will find it fairly simple to determine the root languages of your subjects, of course, both through voice inflection and speech pattern." Now, sitting at table with her son and her Duke and their guests, hearing that Guild Bank representative, Jessica felt a chill of realization. The man was a Harkonnen agent. He had the Geardi Prime speech pattern subtly masked, but exposed to her trained awareness as though he had announced himself. Does this mean the guild itself has taken sides against House Atreides? She asked herself. The thought shocked her, and she masked her emotion by calling for a new dish, all the while listening for the man to betray his purpose. He will shift the conversation next to something seemingly innocent, but with ominous overtones, she told herself. It's his pattern. The banker swallowed, took a sip of wine, smiled at something said to him by the woman on his right. He seemed to listen for a moment to a man down the table who was explaining to the Duke that native Arakeen plants had no thorns. "I enjoy watching the flights of birds on Arrakis," the banker said, directing his words at Jessica. "All of our birds, of course, are carrion eaters, and many exist without water, having become blood drinkers." The stillsuit manufacturer's daughter, seated between Paul and his father at the other end of the table, twisted her pretty face into a frown and said, "Oh, Susu, you say the most disgusting things." The banker smiled. "They call me Susu because I'm financial advisor to the Water Peddlers Union." And as Jessica continued to look at him without comment, he added, "Because of the water seller's cry, Susu Sook." And he imitated the call with such accuracy that many around the table laughed. Jessica heard the boastful tone of voice, but noted most that the young woman had spoken on cue. A set piece. She had produced the excuse for the banker to say what he had said. She glanced at Lingar Butte. The water magnate was scowling, concentrating on his dinner. It came to Jessica that the banker had said, "I, too, control that ultimate source of power on Arrakis, water." Paul had marked the falseness in his dinner companion's voice, saw that his mother was following the conversation with Bene Gesserit intensity. On impulse, he decided to play the foil, draw the exchange out. He addressed himself to the banker. "Do you mean, sir, that these birds are cannibals?" "That's an odd question, young master," the banker said. "I merely said the birds drink blood. It doesn't have to be the blood of their own kind, does it?" "It was not an odd question," Paul said, and Jessica noted the brittle riposte quality of her training exposed in his voice. Most educated people know that the worst potential competition for any young organism can come from its own kind. He deliberately forked a bite of food from his companion's plate, ate it. They are eating from the same bowl. They have the same basic requirements. The banker stiffened, scowled at the Duke. "Do not make the error of considering my son a child," the Duke said, and he smiled. Jessica glanced around the table, noting that Butte had brightened, that both Kynes and the smuggler Tuek were grinning. "It's a rule of ecology," Kynes said, "that the young master appears to understand quite well. The struggle between life elements is the struggle for the free energy of a system. Blood's an efficient energy source." The banker put down his fork, spoke in an angry voice. "It's said that the Fremens come drink the blood of their dead." Kynes shook his head, spoke in a lecturing tone. "Not the blood, sir, but all of a man's water ultimately belongs to his people, to his tribe. It's a necessity when you live near the Great Flat. All water's precious there, and the human body is composed of some 70% water by weight. A dead man, surely, no longer requires that water." The banker put both hands against the table beside his plate, and Jessica thought he was going to push himself back, leave in a rage. Kynes looked at Jessica. "Forgive me, my lady, for elaborating on such an ugly subject at table, but you were being told falsehood, and it needed clarifying." "You've associated so long with Fremen that you've lost all sensibilities," the banker rasped. Kynes looked at him calmly, studied the pale, trembling face. "Are you challenging me, sir?" The banker froze. He swallowed, spoke stiffly. "Of course not. I'd not so insult our host and hostess." Jessica heard the fear in the man's voice, saw it in his face, in his breathing, in the pulse of a vein at his temple. The man was terrified of Kynes. "Our host and hostess are quite capable of deciding for themselves when they've been insulted," Kynes said. "They're brave people who understand defense of honor. We all may attest to their courage by the fact that they are here, now, on Arrakis." Jessica saw that Leto was enjoying this. Most of the others were not. People all around the table sat poised for flight, hands out of sight under the table. Two notable exceptions were Butte, who was openly smiling at the banker's discomfiture, and the smuggler, Tuek, who appeared to be watching Kynes for a cue. Jessica saw that Paul was looking at Kynes in admiration. "Well," Kynes said. "I meant no offence," the banker muttered. "If offence was taken, please accept my apologies." "Freely given, freely accepted," Kynes said. He smiled at Jessica, resumed eating as though nothing had happened. Jessica saw that the smuggler, too, had relaxed. She marked this. The man had shown every respect of an aide ready to leap to Kynes's assistance. There existed an accord of some sort between Kynes and Tuek. Leto toyed with a fork, looked speculatively at Kynes. The ecologist's manner indicated a change in attitude toward the House of Atreides. Kynes had seemed colder on their trip over the desert. Jessica signalled for another course of food and drink. Servants appeared with langue de lapin de Garenne, red wine, and a sauce of mushroom yeast on the side. Slowly the dinner conversation resumed, but Jessica heard the agitation in it, the brittle quality, saw that the banker ate in sullen silence. Kynes would have killed him without hesitating, she thought. And she realized that there was an off-hand attitude toward killing in Kynes's manner. He was a casual killer, and she guessed that this was a Fremen quality. Jessica turned to the stillsuit manufacturer on her left, said, "I find myself continually amazed by the importance of water on Arrakis." "Very important," he agreed. "What is this dish? It's delicious." "Tongues of wild rabbit in a special sauce," she said. "A very old recipe." "I must have that recipe," the man said. She nodded. "I'll see that you get it." Kynes looked at Jessica, said, "The newcomer to Arrakis frequently underestimates the importance of water here. You are dealing, you see, with the law of the minimum." She heard the testing quality in his voice, said, "Growth is limited by that necessity which is present in the least amount, and, naturally, the least favourable condition controls the growth rate." "It's rare to find members of a great house aware of planetological problems," Kynes said. "Water is the least favourable condition for life on Arrakis. And remember that growth itself can produce unfavourable conditions, unless treated with extreme care." Jessica sensed a hidden message in Kynes's words, but knew she was missing it. "Growth," she said. "Do you mean Arrakis can have an orderly cycle of water to sustain human life under more favourable conditions?" "Impossible," the water magnate barked. Jessica turned her attention to Butte. "Impossible?" "Impossible on Arrakis," he said. "Don't listen to this dreamer. All the laboratory evidence is against him." Kynes looked at Butte, and Jessica noted that the other conversations around the table had stopped, while people concentrated on this new interchange. "Laboratory evidence tends to blind us to a very simple fact," Kynes said. "That fact is this. We are dealing here with matters that originated and exist out of doors, where plants and animals carry on their normal existence." "Normal?" Butte snorted. "Nothing about Arrakis is normal." "Quite the contrary," Kynes said. "Certain harmonies could be set up here along self-sustaining lines. You merely have to understand the limits of the planet and the pressures upon it." "It'll never be done," Butte said. The Duke came to a sudden realization, placing the point where Kynes's attitude had changed. It had been when Jessica had spoken of holding the conservatory plants in trust for Arrakis. "What would it take to set up the self-sustaining system, Dr. Kynes?" Leto asked. "If we can get 3% of the green plant element on Arrakis involved in forming carbon compounds as foodstuffs, we've started the cyclic system," Kynes said. "Water's the only problem?" the Duke asked. He sensed Kynes's excitement, felt himself caught up in it. "Water overshadows the other problems," Kynes said. This planet has much oxygen without its usual concomitants, widespread plant life and large sources of free carbon dioxide from such phenomena as volcanoes. There are unusual chemical interchanges over large surface areas here."
"Do you have pilot projects?"
the Duke asked. "We've had a long time in which to build up the Tansley effect, small unit experiments on an amateur basis from which my science may now draw its working facts," Kynes said. "There isn't enough water," Butte said. "There just isn't enough water." "Master Butte is an expert on water," Kynes said. He smiled, turned back to his dinner. The Duke gestured sharply down with his right hand, barked,
"No! I want an answer. Is there enough water, Dr. Kynes?"
Kynes stared at his plate. Jessica watched the play of emotion on his face. He masks himself well, she thought, but she had him registered now and read that he regretted his words.
"Is there enough water?" the Duke demanded.
"There may be," Kynes said. He's faking uncertainty, Jessica thought. With his deeper truth sense, Paul caught the underlying motive, had to use every ounce of his training to mask his excitement. There is enough water, but Kynes doesn't wish it to be known. "Our planetologist has many interesting dreams," Butte said. "He dreams with the Fremen of prophecies and messiahs." Chuckles sounded at odd places around the table. Jessica marked them: the smuggler, the stillsuit manufacturer's daughter, Duncan Idaho, the woman with the mysterious escort service. Tensions are oddly distributed here tonight, Jessica thought. There's too much going on of which I'm not aware. I'll have to develop new information sources. The Duke passed his gaze from Kynes to Butte to Jessica. He felt oddly let down, as though something vital had passed him here.
"Maybe,"
he muttered. Kynes spoke quickly. "Perhaps we should discuss this another time, my lord. There are so many—" The planetologist broke off as a uniformed Atreides trooper hurried in through the service door, was passed by the guard, and rushed to the Duke's side. The man bent, whispering into Leto's ear. Jessica recognized the cap sign of Hawat's Corps, fought down uneasiness. She addressed herself to the stillsuit manufacturer's feminine companion, a tiny, dark-haired woman with a doll face, a touch of epicanthic fold to the eyes. "You've hardly touched your dinner, my dear," Jessica said. "May I order you something?" The woman looked at the stillsuit manufacturer before answering. Then, "I'm not very hungry." Abruptly the Duke stood up beside his trooper, spoke in a harsh tone of command.
"Stay seated, everyone. You will have to forgive me, but a matter has arisen that requires my personal attention."
He stepped aside.
"Paul, take over as host for me, if you please."
Paul stood, wanting to ask why his father had to leave, knowing he had to play this with the grand manner. He moved around to his father's chair, sat down in it. The Duke turned to the alcove where Halleck sat, said,
"Gurney, please take Paul's place at table. We mustn't have an odd number here. When the dinner's over, I may want you to bring Paul to the field CP. Wait for my call."
Halleck emerged from the alcove in dress uniform, his lumpy ugliness seeming out of place in the glittering finery. He leaned his balisette against the wall, crossed to the chair Paul had occupied, sat down.
"There's no need for alarm," the Duke said, "but I must ask that no one leave until our house guard says it's safe. You will be perfectly secure as long as you remain here, and we'll have this little trouble cleared up very shortly."
Paul caught the code words in his father's message. Guard, safe, secure, shortly. The problem was security, not violence. He saw that his mother had read the same message. They both relaxed. The Duke gave a short nod, wheeled, and strode through the service door, followed by his trooper. Paul said, "Please go on with your dinner. I believe Dr. Kynes was discussing water." "May we discuss it another time?" Kynes asked. "By all means," Paul said. And Jessica noted with pride her son's dignity, the mature sense of assurance. The banker picked up his water flagon, gestured with it at Butte. "None of us here can surpass Master Lingar Butte in flowery phrases. One might almost assume he aspired to great house status. Come, Master Butte, lead us in a toast. Perhaps you've a dollop of wisdom for the boy who must be treated like a man." Jessica clenched her right hand into a fist beneath the table. She saw a hand signal pass from Halleck to Idaho, saw the house troopers along the walls move into positions of maximum guard. Butte cast a venomous glare at the banker. Paul glanced at Halleck, took in the defensive positions of his guards, looked at the banker until the man lowered the water flagon. He said, "Once, on Caladan, I saw the body of a drowned fisherman recovered. He—" "Drowned?" It was the stillsuit manufacturer's daughter. Paul hesitated, then— "Yes, immersed in water until dead. Drowned." "What an interesting way to die," she murmured. Paul's smile became brittle. He returned his attention to the banker. "The interesting thing about this man was the wounds on his shoulders, made by another fisherman's claw boots. This fisherman was one of several in a boat, a craft for travelling on water, that foundered, sank beneath the water. Another fisherman helping recover the body said he'd seen marks like this man's wounds several times. They meant another drowning fisherman had tried to stand on this poor fellow's shoulders in the attempt to reach up to the surface, to reach air." "Why is this interesting?" the banker asked. "Because of an observation made by my father at the time. He said, the drowning man who climbs on your shoulders to save himself is understandable, except when you see it happen in the drawing room." Paul hesitated just long enough for the banker to see the point coming. Then, "And, I should add, except when you see it at the dinner table." A sudden stillness enfolded the room. That was rash, Jessica thought. This banker might have enough rank to call my son out. She saw that Idaho was poised for instant action. The house troopers were alert. Gurney Halleck had his eyes on the men opposite him. "Ho, ho, ho!" It was the smuggler, Tuek, head thrown back, laughing with complete abandon. Nervous smiles appeared around the table. Butte was grinning. The banker had pushed his chair back, was glaring at Paul. Kynes said, "One baits an Atreides at his own risk." "Is it Atreides' custom to insult their guests?" the banker demanded. Before Paul could answer, Jessica leaned forward, said, "Sir," and she thought, we must learn this Harkonnen creature's game. Is he here to try for Paul? Does he have help? "My son displays a general garment, and you claim it's cut to your fit?" Jessica asked. "What a fascinating revelation." She slid a hand down to her leg, to the crysknife she had fastened in a calf sheath. The banker turned his glare on Jessica. Eyes shifted away from Paul, and she saw him ease himself back from the table, freeing himself for action. He had focused on the code word, garment. Prepare for violence. Kynes directed a speculative look at Jessica, gave a subtle hand signal to Tuek. The smuggler lurched to his feet, lifted his flagon. "I'll give you a toast," he said, "to young Paul Atreides, still a lad by his looks, but a man by his actions." "Why do they intrude?" Jessica asked herself. The banker stared now at Kynes, and Jessica saw terror return to the agent's face. People began responding all around the table. Where Kynes leads, people follow, Jessica thought. He has told us he sides with Paul. What's the secret of his power? It can't be because he's judge of the change, that's temporary, and certainly not because he's a civil servant. She removed her hand from the crysknife hilt, lifted her flagon to Kynes, who responded in kind. Only Paul and the banker, Susu, what an idiotic nickname, Jessica thought, remained empty-handed. The banker's attention stayed fixed on Kynes. Paul stared at his plate. I was handling it correctly, Paul thought. Why do they interfere? He glanced covertly at the male guests nearest him. Prepare for violence? From whom? Certainly not from that banker fellow. Halleck stirred, spoke as though to no one in particular, directing his words over the heads of the guests across from him. In our society, people shouldn't be quick to take offence. It's frequently suicidal. He looked at the stillsuit manufacturer's daughter beside him. Don't you think so, miss?
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed I do, she said. There's too much violence. It makes me sick. And lots of times no offence is meant, but people die anyway. It doesn't make sense.
Indeed it doesn't, Halleck said. Jessica saw the near perfection of the girl's act, realized that empty-headed little female is not an empty-headed little female. She saw then the pattern of the threat and understood that Halleck too had detected it. They had planned to lure Paul with sex. Jessica relaxed. Her son had probably been the first to see it. His training hadn't overlooked that obvious gambit. Kynes spoke to the banker. Isn't another apology in order? The banker turned a sickly grin toward Jessica, said, My lady, I fear I've overindulged in your wines. You serve potent drink at table, and I'm not accustomed to it. Jessica heard the venom beneath his tone, spoke sweetly. When strangers meet, great allowance should be made for differences of custom and training. Thank you, my lady, he said. The dark-haired companion of the stillsuit manufacturer leaned toward Jessica, said,
The Duke spoke of our being secure here. I do hope that doesn't mean more fighting.
She was directed to lead the conversation this way, Jessica thought. Likely this will prove unimportant, Jessica said, but there's so much detail requiring the Duke's personal attention in these times. As long as enmity continues between Atreides and Harkonnen, we cannot be too careful. The Duke has sworn Khanli. He will leave no Harkonnen agent alive on Arrakis, of course. She glanced at the Guild Bank agent, and the conventions naturally support him in this. She shifted her attention to Kynes. Is this not so, Dr. Kynes? Indeed it is, Kynes said. The stillsuit manufacturer pulled his companion gently back. She looked at him, said, I do believe I'll eat something now. I'd like some of that bird dish you served earlier. Jessica signalled a servant, turned to the banker. And you, sir, were speaking of birds earlier and of their habits. I find so many interesting things about Arrakis. Tell me, where is the spice found? Do the hunters go deep into the desert? Oh, no, my lady, he said. Very little's known of the deep desert, and almost nothing of the southern regions. There's a tale that a great mother-lode of spice is to be found in the southern reaches, Kynes said. But I suspect it was an imaginative invention, made solely for purposes of a song. Some daring spice hunters do, on occasion, penetrate into the edge of the central belt, but that's extremely dangerous. Navigation is uncertain. Storms are frequent. Casualties increase dramatically the farther you operate from shield wall bases. It hasn't been found profitable to venture too far south. Perhaps if we had a weather satellite. Butte looked up, spoke around a mouthful of food. It said the Fremen travel there, that they go anywhere and have hunted out soaks and sipwells even in the southern latitudes. Soaks and sipwells? Jessica asked. Kynes spoke quickly. Wild rumours, my lady. These are known on other planets, not on Arrakis. A soak is a place where water seeps to the surface, or near enough to the surface to be found by digging according to certain signs. A sip well is a form of soak, where a person draws water through a straw. So it is said. There's deception in his words, Jessica thought. Why is he lying? Paul wondered. How very interesting, Jessica said. And she thought, it is said. What a curious speech mannerism they have here. If they only knew what it reveals about their dependence on superstitions. I've heard you have a saying, Paul said, that polish comes from the cities, wisdom from the desert. There are many sayings on Arrakis, Kynes said. Before Jessica could frame a new question, a servant bent over her with a note. She opened it, saw the Duke's handwriting and code signs, scanned it. You'll all be delighted to know, she said, that our Duke sends his reassurances.
The matter which called him away has been settled. The missing carryall has been found. A Harkonnen agent in the crew overpowered the others and flew the machine to a smuggler's base, hoping to sell it there. Both man and machine were turned over to our forces. She nodded to Tuek. The smuggler nodded back. Jessica refolded the note, tucked it into her sleeve. "I'm glad it didn't come to open battle," the banker said. "The people have such hopes the Atreides will bring peace and prosperity." "Especially prosperity," Butte said. "Shall we have our dessert now?" Jessica asked. "I've had our chef prepare a Caladan sweet, pongy rice in sauce dulce." "It sounds wonderful," the stillsuit manufacturer said. "Would it be possible to get the recipe?" "Any recipe you desire," Jessica said, registering the man for later mention to Howard. The stillsuit manufacturer was a fearful little climber, and could be bought. Small talk resumed around her. "Such a lovely fabric. He's having a setting made to match the jewel. We might try for a production increase next quarter." Jessica stared down at her plate, thinking of the coded part of Leto's message. "The Harkonnens tried to get in a shipment of laser guns. We captured them. This may mean they've succeeded with other shipments. It certainly means they don't place much store in shields. Take appropriate precautions." Jessica focused her mind on laser guns, wondering. The white-hot beams of disruptive light could cut through any known substance, provided that substance was not shielded. The fact that feedback from a shield would explode both laser gun and shield did not bother the Harkonnens. Why? A laser gun shield explosion was a dangerous variable, could be more powerful than atomics, could kill only the gunner and his shielded target. The unknowns here filled her with uneasiness. Paul said, "I've never doubted we'd find the carryall. Once my father moves to solve a problem, he solves it. This is a fact the Harkonnens are beginning to discover." He's boasting, Jessica thought. He shouldn't boast. No person who'll be sleeping far below ground level this night as a precaution against laser guns has the right to boast.
There is no escape. We pay for the violence of our ancestors. From the collected sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
Jessica heard the disturbance in the great hall, turned on the light beside her bed. The clock there had not been properly adjusted to local time, and she had to subtract 21 minutes to determine that it was about 2 a.m. The disturbance was loud and incoherent. Is this the Harkonnen attack? She wondered. She slipped out of bed, checked the screen monitors to see where her family was. The screen showed Paul asleep in the deep cellar room they'd hastily converted to a bedroom for him. The noise obviously wasn't penetrating to his quarters. There was no one in the Duke's room. His bed was unrumpled. Was he still at the Field CP? There were no screens yet to the front of the house. Jessica stood in the middle of her room, listening. There was one shouting, incoherent voice. She heard someone call for Dr. Yui. Jessica found a robe, pulled it over her shoulders, pushed her feet into slippers, strapped the crysknife to her leg. Again a voice called out for Yui. Jessica belted the robe around her, stepped into the hallway. Then the thought struck her, what if Leto's hurt? The hall seemed to stretch out forever under her running feet. She turned through the arch at the end, dashed past the dining hall and down the passage to the great hall, finding the place brightly lighted, all the wall suspensors glowing at maximum. To her right, near the front entry, she saw 2 house guards holding Duncan Idaho between them. His head lolled forward, and there was an abrupt, panting silence to the scene. One of the house guards spoke accusingly to Idaho. "You see what you did? You woke the Lady Jessica." The great draperies billowed behind the men, showing that the front door remained open. There was no sign of the Duke or Yui. Mapes stood to one side, staring coldly at Idaho. She wore a long brown robe with serpentine design at the hem. Her feet were pushed into unlaced desert boots. "So I woke the Lady Jessica," Idaho muttered. He lifted his face toward the ceiling, bellowed, "My sword was first blooded on Grumman." Great mother, he's drunk, Jessica thought. Idaho's dark, round face was drawn into a frown. His hair, curling like the fur of a black goat, was plastered with dirt. A jagged rent in his tunic exposed an expanse of the dress shirt he had worn at the dinner party earlier. Jessica crossed to him. One of the guards nodded to her without releasing his hold on Idaho. "We didn't know what to do with him, my lady. He was creating a disturbance out front, refusing to come inside. We were afraid locals might come along and see him. That wouldn't do at all. Give us a bad name here." "Where has he been?" Jessica asked. "He escorted one of the young ladies home from the dinner, my lady. Howart's orders." "Which young lady?" "One of the escort wenches. You understand, my lady?" He glanced at Mapes, lowered his voice. "They're always calling on Idaho for special surveillance of the ladies." And Jessica thought, so they are. But why is he drunk? She frowned, turned to Mapes. "Mapes, bring a stimulant. I'd suggest caffeine. Perhaps there's some of the spice coffee left." Mapes shrugged, headed for the kitchen. Her unlaced desert boots slap-slapped against the stone floor. Idaho swung his unsteady head around to peer at an angle toward Jessica. "Killed more than 300 men for the Duke," he muttered. "What I want to know is why Mimir can't live under the ground here. Can't live on the ground here. What kind of place is this, huh?" A sound from the side hall entry caught Jessica's attention. She turned, saw Yui crossing to them, his medical kit swinging in his left hand. He was fully dressed, looked pale, exhausted. The diamond tattoo stood out sharply on his forehead. "The good doctor!" Idaho shouted. "Was you, Doc? Splint pill man?" He turned blearily toward Jessica. "Making a damn fool of myself, huh?" Jessica frowned, remained silent, wondering, why would Idaho get drunk? Was he drugged? "Too much spice beer," Idaho said, attempting to straighten. Mapes returned with a steaming cup in her hands, stopped uncertainly behind Yui. She looked at Jessica, who shook her head. Yui put his kit on the floor, nodded greeting to Jessica, said, "Spice beer, eh?" "Best damn stuff ever tasted," Idaho said. He tried to pull himself to attention. "My sword was first blooded on Grumman. Killed a Harkin. Killed him for the Duke." Yui turned, looked at the cup in Mapes's hand. "What is that?" "Caffeine," Jessica said. Yui took the cup, held it toward Idaho. "Drink this, lad." "Don't want any more to drink." "Drink it, I say." Idaho's head wobbled toward Yui, and he stumbled one step ahead, dragging the guards with him. "I'm almighty fed up with pleasing the Imperial Universe, Doc. Just once we're gonna do the thing my way." "After you drink this," Yui said. "It's just caffeine." "It's probably like all the rest of this place. Damn sun's too bright. Nothing has the right colour. Everything's wrong, or—" "Well, it's night time now," Yui said. He spoke reasonably. "Drink this like a good lad. It'll make you feel better." "Don't want to feel better." "We can't argue with him all night," Jessica said, and she thought, this calls for shock treatment. "There's no reason for you to stay, my lady," Yui said. "I can take care of this." Jessica shook her head. She stepped forward, slapped Idaho sharply across the cheek. He stumbled back with his guards glaring at her. "This is no way to act in your Duke's home," she said. She snatched the cup from Yui's hands, spilling part of it, thrust the cup toward Idaho. "Now drink this. That's an order." Idaho jerked himself upright, scowling down at her. He spoke slowly, with careful and precise enunciation. "I do not take orders from a damn Harkonnen spy." Yui stiffened, whirled to face Jessica. Her face had gone pale, but she was nodding. It all became clear to her. The broken stems of meaning she had seen in words and actions around her these past few days could now be translated. She found herself in the grip of anger almost too great to contain. It took the most profound of her Bene Gesserit training to quiet her pulse and smooth her breathing. Even then she could feel the blaze flickering. They were always calling on Idaho for surveillance of the ladies. She shot a glance at Yui. The doctor lowered his eyes. "You knew this?" she demanded.
"I heard rumors, my lady, but I didn't want to add to your burdens."
"Hawat," she snapped. "I want Thufir Hawat brought to me immediately."
"But, my lady—"
"Immediately." It has to be Hawat, she thought. Suspicion such as this could come from no other source without being discarded immediately. Idaho shook his head, mumbled, "Chuck the whole damn thing." Jessica looked down at the cup in her hand, abruptly dashed its contents across Idaho's face.
"Lock him in one of the guest rooms of the East Wing," she ordered. "Let him sleep it off."
The two guards stared at her unhappily. One ventured,
"Perhaps we should take him someplace else, milady. We could—"
"He's supposed to be here," Jessica snapped. "He has a job to do here." Her voice dripped bitterness.
"He's so good at watching the ladies."
The guard swallowed.
"Do you know where the Duke is?"
she demanded. "He's at the command post, my lady." "Is Hawat with him?" "Hawat's in the city, my lady."
"You will bring Hawat to me at once," Jessica said. "I will be in my sitting room when he arrives."
"But, my lady—"
"If necessary, I will call the Duke," she said. "I hope it will not be necessary. I would not want to disturb him with this."
"Yes, my lady." Jessica thrust the empty cup into Mapes's hands, met the questioning stare of the blue within blue eyes.
"You may return to bed, Mapes."
"You're sure you'll not need me?" Jessica smiled grimly.
"I'm sure." "Perhaps this could wait until tomorrow," Yui said. "I could give you a sedative and—" "You will return to your quarters and leave me to handle this my way," she said. She patted his arm to take the sting out of her command. "This is the only way." Abruptly, head high, she turned and stalked off through the house to her rooms. Cold walls, passages, a familiar door. She jerked the door open, strode in, and slammed it behind her. Jessica stood there, glaring at the shield-blanked windows of her sitting room. Hawat! Could he be the one the Harkonnens bought? We shall see. Jessica crossed to the deep, old-fashioned armchair with an embroidered cover of schlag skin, moved the chair into position to command the door. She was suddenly very conscious of the crysknife in its sheath on her leg. She removed the sheath and strapped it to her arm, tested the drop of it. Once more she glanced around the room, placing everything precisely in her mind against any emergency. The chaise near the corner, the straight chairs along the wall, the two low tables, her stand-mounted zither beside the door to her bedroom. Pale rose light glowed from the dispenser lamps. She dimmed them, sat down in the armchair, patting the upholstery, appreciating the chair's regal heaviness for this occasion. Now let him come, she thought. We shall see what we shall see. And she prepared herself in the Bene Gesserit fashion for the wait, accumulating patience, saving her strength. Sooner than she had expected, a rap sounded at the door and Hawat entered at her command. She watched him without moving from the chair, seeing the crackling sense of drug-induced energy in his movements, seeing the fatigue beneath. Hawat's rheumy old eyes glittered. His leathery skin appeared faintly yellow in the room's light, and there was a wide, wet stain on the sleeve of his knife arm. She smelled blood there. Jessica gestured to one of the straight-backed chairs, said, "Bring that chair and sit facing me." Hawat bowed, obeyed. That drunken fool of an Idaho, he thought. He studied Jessica's face, wondering how he could save this situation. "It's long past time to clear the air between us," Jessica said. "What troubles, my lady?" He sat down, placed hands on knees. "Don't play coy with me," she snapped. "If Hughie didn't tell you why I summoned you, then one of your spies in my household did. Shall we be at least that honest with each other?"
"As you wish, my lady."
"First, you will answer me one question," she said. "Are you now a Harkonnen agent?" Howard surged half out of his chair, his face dark with fury, demanding, "You dare insult me so?" "Sit down," she said. "You insulted me so." Slowly he sank back into the chair, and Jessica, reading the signs of this face that she knew so well, allowed herself a deep breath. "It isn't Howard." "Now I know you remain loyal to my Duke," she said. "I'm prepared, therefore, to forgive your affront to me."
"Is there something to forgive?"
Jessica scowled, wondering. Shall I play my trump? Shall I tell him of the Duke's daughter I've carried within me these few weeks? No. Leto himself doesn't know. This would only complicate his life, divert him in a time when he must concentrate on our survival. There is yet time to use this. "A truth-sayer would solve this," she said, "but we have no truth-sayer qualified by the High Board."
"As you say, we've no truth-sayer."
"Is there a traitor among us?" she asked. "I've studied our people with great care. Who could it be? Not Gurney. Certainly not Duncan. Their lieutenants are not strategically enough placed to consider. It's not you, Thufir. It cannot be Paul. I know it's not me. Dr. Yueh, then? Shall I call him and put him to the test?"
"You know that's an empty gesture,"
Howard said.
"He's conditioned by the High College. That I know for certain."
"Not to mention that his wife was a Bene Gesserit slain by the Harkonnens," Jessica said.
"So that's what happened to her,"
Howard said. "Haven't you heard the hate in his voice when he speaks the Harkonnen name?"
"You know I don't have the ear,"
Howard said. "What brought this base suspicion on me?" she asked. Howard frowned.
"My lady puts her servant in an impossible position. My first loyalty is to the Duke."
"I'm prepared to forgive much because of that loyalty," she said.
"And again I must ask, is there something to forgive?"
"Stalemate?" she asked. He shrugged. "Let us discuss something else for a minute, then," she said. "Duncan Idaho, the admirable fighting man whose abilities at guarding and surveillance are so esteemed. Tonight he overindulged in something called spice beer. I hear reports that others among our people have been stupefied by this concoction. Is that true?"
"You have your reports, my lady."
"So I do. Don't you see this drinking as a symptom, Thufir?"
"My lady speaks riddles."
"Apply your mentat abilities to it," she snapped. "What's the problem with Duncan and the others? I can tell you in 4 words. They have no home." He jabbed a finger at the floor.
"Arrakis? That's their home?"
"Arrakis is an unknown. Caladan was their home, but we've uprooted them. They have no home, and they fear the Duke's failing them." He stiffened.
"Such talk from one of the men would be cause for—"
"Oh, stop that, Thufir. Is it defeatist or treacherous for a doctor to diagnose a disease correctly? My only intention is to cure the disease."
"The Duke gives me charge over such matters."
"But you understand, I have a certain natural concern over the progress of this disease," she said. "And perhaps you'll grant I have certain abilities along these lines." Will I have to shock him severely? She wondered. He needs shaking up, something to break him from routine.
"There could be many interpretations for your concern,"
Howard said. He shrugged. "Then you've already convicted me?"
"Of course not, my lady, but I cannot afford to take any chances, the situation being what it is."
"A threat to my son got past you, right here in this house," she said. "Who took that chance?" His face darkened.
"I offered my resignation to the Duke."
"Did you offer your resignation to me? Or to Paul?"
Now he was openly angry, betraying it in quickness of breathing, in dilation of nostrils, a steady stare. She saw a pulse beating at his temple.
"I'm the Duke's man," he said,
biting off the words.
"There is no traitor," she said. "The threat's something else. Perhaps it has to do with lasguns. Perhaps they'll risk secreting a few lasguns with timing mechanisms aimed at house shields. Perhaps they'll—" "And who could tell after the blast if the explosion wasn't atomic?" he asked. "No, my lady, they'll not risk anything that illegal. Radiation lingers. The evidence is hard to erase. No, they'll observe most of the forms. It has to be a traitor."
"You're the Duke's man," she sneered. "Would you destroy him in the effort to save him?" He took a deep breath, then,
"If you're innocent, you'll have my most abject apologies."
"Look at you now, Thufir," she said. "Humans live best when each has his own place, when each knows where he belongs in the scheme of things. Destroy the place and destroy the person. You and I, Thufir, of all those who love the Duke, are most ideally situated to destroy the other's place. Could I not whisper suspicions about you into the Duke's ear at night? When would he be most susceptible to such whispering, Thufir? Must I draw it for you more clearly?"
"You threaten me?"
he growled. "Indeed not. I merely point out to you that someone is attacking us through the basic arrangement of our lives. It's clever, diabolical. I propose to negate this attack by so ordering our lives that there'll be no chinks for such barbs to enter."
"You accuse me of whispering baseless suspicions?"
"Baseless, yes."
"You'd meet this with your own whispers?"
"Your life is compounded of whispers, not mine, Thufir."
"Then you question my abilities."
She sighed. "Thufir, I want you to examine your own emotional involvement in this. The natural human's an animal without logic. Your projections of logic onto all affairs is unnatural, but suffered to continue for its usefulness. You are the embodiment of logic, a mentat. Yet your problem solutions are concepts that, in a very real sense, are projected outside yourself, there to be studied and rolled around, examined from all sides."
"You think now to teach me my trade?"
he asked, and he did not try to hide the disdain in his voice. "Anything outside yourself, this you can see and apply your logic to it," she said. "But it's a human trait that when we encounter personal problems, those things most deeply personal are the most difficult to bring out for our logic to scan. We tend to flounder around, blaming everything but the actual deep-seated thing that's really chewing on us."
"You're deliberately attempting to undermine my faith in my abilities as a mentat," he rasped. "Were I to find one of our people attempting thus to sabotage any other weapon in our arsenal, I should not hesitate to denounce and destroy him."
"The finest mentats have a healthy respect for the error factor in their computations," she said.
"I've never said otherwise."
"Then apply yourself to these symptoms we've both seen. Drunkenness among the men, quarrels. They gossip and exchange wild rumours about Arrakis. They ignore the most simple—"
"Idleness no more," he said. "Don't try to divert my attention by trying to make a simple matter appear mysterious."
She stared at him, thinking of the Duke's men rubbing their woes together in the barracks until you could almost smell the charge there, like burnt insulation. They're becoming like the men of the pre-Guild legend, she thought. Like the men of the lost star-searcher, Ampoliros, sick at their guns, forever seeking, forever prepared, and forever unready. "Why have you never made full use of my abilities in your service to the Duke?" she asked. "Do you fear a rival for your position?" He glared at her, the old eyes blazing.
"I know something of the training they give you, Bene Gesserit."
He broke off, scowling. "Go ahead, say it," she said. "Bene Gesserit witches."
"I know something of the real training they give you," he said. "I've seen it come out in Paul. I'm not fooled by what your schools tell the public. You exist only to serve."
The shock must be severe. And he's almost ready for it, she thought. You listen respectfully to me in counsel, she said, yet you seldom heed my advice. Why? I don't trust your Bene Gesserit motives, he said. You may think you can look through a man. You may think you can make a man do exactly what you— You poor fool, Thufir, she raged. He scowled, pushing himself back in the chair. Whatever rumours you've heard about our schools, she said, the truth is far greater. If I wished to destroy the Duke, or you, or any other person within my reach, you could not stop me. And she thought, why do I let pride drive such words out of me? This is not the way I was trained. This is not how I must shock him. Hawat slipped a hand beneath his tunic, where he kept a tiny projector of poison darts. She wears no shield, he thought. Is this just a brag she makes? I could slay her now, but— the consequences if I'm wrong. Jessica saw the gesture toward his pocket, said, Let us pray violence shall never be necessary between us. A worthy prayer, he agreed. Meanwhile, the sickness spreads among us, she said. I must ask you again, isn't it more reasonable to suppose the Harkonnens have planted this suspicion to pit the two of us against each other? We appear to have returned to stalemate, he said. She sighed, thinking, he's almost ready for it. The Duke and I are father and mother surrogates to our people, she said. The position— He hasn't married you, Hawat said. She forced herself to calmness, thinking, a good riposte, that. But he'll not marry anyone else, she said. Not as long as I live. And we are surrogates, as I've said. To break up this natural order in our affairs, to disturb, disrupt, and confuse us, which target offers itself most enticingly to the Harkonnens? He sensed the direction she was taking, and his brows drew down in a lowering scowl. The Duke? She asked. Attractive target, yes. But no one, with the possible exception of Paul, is better guarded. Me? I tempt them, surely. But they must know the Bene Gesserit make difficult targets. And there's a better target, one whose duties create, necessarily, a monstrous blind spot, one to whom suspicion is as natural as breathing, one who builds his entire life on innuendo and mystery. She darted her right hand toward him. You! Hawat started to leap from his chair. I have not dismissed you, Thufir, she flared. The old Mentat almost fell back into the chair, so quickly did his muscles betray him. She smiled without mirth. Now you know something of the real training they give us, she said. Hawat tried to swallow in a dry throat. Her command had been regal, peremptory, uttered in a tone and manner he had found completely irresistible. His body had obeyed her before he could think about it. Nothing could have prevented his response, not logic, not passionate anger, nothing. To do what she had done spoke of a sensitive, intimate knowledge of the person thus commanded, a depth of control he had not dreamed possible. I have said to you before that we should understand each other, she said. I meant you should understand me. I already understand you. And I tell you now that your loyalty to the Duke is all that guarantees your safety with me. He stared at her, wet his lips with his tongue. If I desired a puppet, the Duke would marry me, she said. He might even think he did it of his own free will. Hawat lowered his head, looked upward through his sparse lashes. Only the most rigid control kept him from calling the guard. Control. And the suspicion now that woman might not permit it. His skin crawled with the memory of how she had controlled him. In the moment of hesitation she could have drawn a weapon and killed him. Does every human have this blind spot? He wondered. Can any of us be ordered into action before he can resist? The idea staggered him. Who could stop a person with such power? You've glimpsed the fist within the Bene Gesserit glove, she said.
Few glimpse it and live. And what I did was a relatively simple thing for us. You've not seen my entire arsenal. Think on that.
Why aren't you out destroying the Duke's enemies? He asked.
What would you have me destroy? She asked. Would you have me make a weakling of our Duke? Have him forever leaning on me?
But with such power—
Power's a two-edged sword, Thufir, she said. You think, how easy for her to shape a human tool to thrust into an enemy's vitals. True, Thufir, even into your vitals. Yet what would I accomplish? If enough of us, Bene Gesserit, did this, wouldn't it make all Bene Gesserit suspect? We don't want that, Thufir. We do not wish to destroy ourselves. She nodded. We truly exist only to serve.
I cannot answer you, he said. You know I cannot answer.
You'll say nothing about what has happened here to anyone, she said. I know you, Thufir.
My lady.
Again the old man tried to swallow in a dry throat. And he thought, she has great powers, yes, but would these not make her an even more formidable tool for the Harkonnens? The Duke could be destroyed as quickly by his friends as by his enemies, she said. I trust now you'll get to the bottom of this suspicion and remove it.
If it proves baseless, he said.
If, she sneered.
If,
he said. You are tenacious, she said.
Cautious, he said, and aware of the error factor.
Then I'll pose another question for you. What does it mean to you that you stand before another human, that you are bound and helpless, and the other human holds a knife at your throat, yet this other human refrains from killing you, frees you from your bonds, and gives you the knife to use as you will? She lifted herself out of the chair, turned her back on him. You may go now, Thufir. The old Mentat arose, hesitated, hand creeping toward the deadly weapon beneath his tunic. He was reminded of the bull ring, and of the Duke's father, who'd been brave no matter what his other failings, and one day of the corrida long ago. The fierce black beast had stood there, head bowed, immobilized and confused. The old Duke had turned his back on the horns, cape thrown flamboyantly over one arm, while cheers rained down from the stands. I am the bull, and she the matador, Hawat thought. He withdrew his hand from the weapon, glanced at the sweat glistening in his empty palm, and he knew that whatever the facts proved to be in the end, he would never forget this moment, nor lose this sense of supreme admiration for the Lady Jessica. Quietly, he turned and left the room. Jessica lowered her gaze from the reflection in the windows, turned, and stared at the closed door. Now we'll see some proper action, she whispered.